Welcome, guardian of tomorrow's dawn, to a journey through the shadows of Gotham's most complex redemption, where death becomes transformation and failure blooms into fierce determination. Tonight, we shall trace the complete chronicles of Jason Peter Todd, from orphaned street thief to fallen Robin, from vengeful Red Hood to reluctant hero, seeking his place in a world that has both abandoned and embraced him. Let the rhythm of heartbeats and the whisper of pages turning carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore every thread of tragedy and triumph that has woven the tapestry of Batman's greatest failure turned unexpected salvation. In the labyrinthine depths of Gotham City's most forsaken district, where hope withers beneath the perpetual shadow of towering tenements and desperation seeps through cracked concrete like winter rain, there began the story of a child whose very existence would challenge every assumption about the relationship between circumstance and character, between the darkness that breeds in urban decay and the light that can somehow emerge from even the most unlikely sources. This was Crime Alley, a place whose name spoke truth with brutal honesty, where the innocent were devoured and the guilty thrived, where the cycle of poverty and violence ground forward with mechanical inevitability, crushing dreams and lives with equal indifference. Into this realm of shadows was born Jason Peter Todd on a night when the city's sirens wailed their familiar lament and the stars remained hidden behind a veil of industrial smoke and moral corruption. His first cries echoed through the thin walls of a cramped apartment that served as both home and prison for a family already fractured by the weight of circumstances beyond their control or understanding. The child who would one day wear the cape and colors of Robin entered the world not with celebration, but with the quiet desperation of parents who knew that bringing life into such darkness was itself an act of either profound faith or devastating delusion. The woman who raised him during those earliest years carried the name Catherine Todd, though she had not given him birth, a fact that would remain hidden from the boy for most of his childhood and adolescence. Catherine was a soul broken by forces she could neither comprehend nor resist, a casualty of the same urban warfare that claimed thousands of victims each year without attracting the attention of those who possessed the power to enact meaningful change. Her battle was not fought with weapons or violence, but with the slower, more insidious enemy of pharmaceutical escape, the needle and powder that promised relief from pain, but delivered only deeper suffering and progressive isolation from everything that might have provided genuine healing. Her addiction was not chosen from weakness or moral failing, but emerged from the intersection of chronic pain, inadequate medical care, and the readily available alternative medicines that flowed through Crime Alley's veins like poison masquerading as salvation. The prescription painkillers that had initially been legitimately prescribed for a back injury sustained during her work in one of Gotham's countless unsafe factories had gradually increased in dosage and decreased in effectiveness, leading to the inevitable progression towards street drugs that promised similar relief at a fraction of the cost, and with none of the bureaucratic obstacles that prevented legal access. Jason's earliest memories were shaped by the rhythm of his stepmother's illness, the unpredictable cycle of withdrawal and temporary relief that governed the household's emotional climate with tyrannical inconsistency. He learned to read the signs of her condition with the acute perception that children develop when their survival depends upon understanding adult behavior that makes no logical sense to young minds. The glazed look that meant she would be unreachable for hours, the trembling and sweating that preceded her desperate searches through drawers and cabinets, the brief periods of false normalcy that followed her mysterious disappearances and equally mysterious returns. The man who claimed paternity and provided what passed for masculine authority in Jason's early life was Willis Todd, a figure whose relationship with his son was complicated by the intersection of genuine affection and the practical demands of criminal enterprise. Willis possessed neither the education nor the legitimate opportunities that might have provided alternatives to the illegal activities that sustained his family's meager existence. Yet he was not without intelligence or moral awareness of the contradiction between his actions and his aspirations for his son's future. The criminal underworld of Crime Alley operated according to its own economic principles and social hierarchies, creating opportunities for those willing to accept the risks while simultaneously trapping them within cycles of violence and legal jeopardy that made escape increasingly difficult with each passing year. Willis found himself drawn into this shadow economy, not from ambition or greed, but from the simple mathematics of survival in an urban environment where legitimate employment paid wages insufficient to support a family while illegal. Activities offered the possibility of providing for his wife's medical needs and his son's basic requirements. His work began with small-scale drug distribution, serving as an intermediary between higher-level suppliers and street-level dealers, a position that required neither significant capital investment nor specialized skills, but offered enough income to maintain their household while keeping him relatively insulated from direct contact with law enforcement. Yet the very nature of such work made advancement within criminal hierarchies almost inevitable, as success in minor roles led to opportunities for greater responsibility and correspondingly greater danger. The progression from drug runner to occasional muscle for various criminal enterprises reflected Willis's gradual entanglement in webs of obligation and mutual dependence that characterized organized crime's social structure. His association with figures like Harvey Dent, before the man's transformation into Two-Face, demonstrated how the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate power often blurred in Gotham's corrupt political landscape, where district attorneys and crime bosses sometimes found their interests temporarily aligned. Jason's childhood unfolded against this backdrop of moral ambiguity and constant tension, where the adults who should have provided stability and guidance were themselves struggling to navigate circumstances that offered no clear paths toward improvement or escape. The boy learned early to be self-reliant, to ask few questions about the sources of money that occasionally appeared to pay for food and rent, to understand that survival sometimes required accepting help from sources that respectable people would reject. The apartment that served as his primary home during these formative years was a testament to the systematic neglect that characterized Gotham's approach to its most vulnerable populations. The building's infrastructure had been deteriorating for decades, with heating systems that functioned sporadically, plumbing that backed up regularly, and electrical wiring that posed constant fire hazards. The walls were thin enough to carry sound between units, creating an involuntary intimacy with neighbors whose own struggles with poverty, addiction, and violence provided a constant reminder of how precarious their family's situation truly was. Yet within this environment of deprivation and danger, Jason began to develop the qualities that would later define his approach to heroism and justice. His natural intelligence expressed itself through an intuitive understanding of human motivation and social dynamics that allowed him to navigate the complex relationships that governed street life. He learned to read facial expressions and body language with the skill of a professional interrogator, to identify lies and hidden agendas with the certainty of someone whose survival had always depended upon accurate assessment of adult intentions. The education he received was necessarily unconventional, gained through observation and experience rather than formal instruction. The streets of Crime Alley served as his classroom, teaching lessons about power and vulnerability, about the difference between justice and law, about the ways that desperation could corrupt even fundamentally decent people. He witnessed acts of extraordinary kindness and casual cruelty, often from the same individuals, learning that human nature was far more complex than the simple moral categories that governed mainstream society's understanding of right and wrong. His stepmother's decline provided particularly painful instruction in the relationship between love and helplessness, as Catherine's addiction progressively eroded her capacity for consistent emotional connection, while never entirely eliminating her genuine affection for the boy she had raised as her own son. Jason learned to treasure the moments of clarity when her true personality emerged from beneath the chemical haze, while also developing the emotional resilience necessary to function during the longer periods when her addiction rendered her essentially absent from his daily life. The responsibility for maintaining their household increasingly fell upon Jason's small shoulders as Catherine's condition deteriorated and Willis became more deeply involved in criminal activities that required his attention and presence elsewhere. The boy learned to forge signatures on school forms, to make excuses to neighbors who inquired about his parents' whereabouts, to stretch limited food supplies across weeks when money was scarce, to navigate the city's bureaucratic systems when dealing with utilities and rent collection. These early experiences with adult responsibility created in Jason a maturity that exceeded his chronological age, while also fostering resentment toward the circumstances that had stolen his childhood and forced him to assume burdens that should have been carried by the adults in his life. The anger that would later characterize his approach to crime fighting had its roots in this period, growing from his intimate knowledge of how systemic failures and individual weakness combined to create unnecessary suffering for those least equipped to defend themselves. The criminal education that Willis provided, whether intentionally or through Jason's observation of his activities, included practical skills that would prove invaluable during his later career as both Robin and Red Hood. The boy learned to pick locks through watching his father bypass security measures, to read people's intentions through studying Willis's interactions with dangerous associates, to move silently through urban environments by accompanying his father on various nocturnal enterprises. Yet perhaps most importantly, Jason absorbed from Willis a complex understanding of the relationship between crime and survival that would fundamentally shape his later philosophical conflicts with Batman's rigid moral code. Through his father's example, he learned that good people sometimes did bad things for reasons that were comprehensible and even sympathetic, that the categories of villain and victim often overlapped, that the luxury of moral absolutism was available only to those who had never faced genuine desperation. The death of Willis Todd, whether through violence or incarceration, depending upon which version of events proved most accurate, marked the beginning of Jason's complete independence from adult supervision and protection. The loss of his father figure, however flawed that relationship had been, removed the last barrier between the boy and the full, harsh reality of Crime Alley's unforgiving environment. Catherine's addiction had already rendered her essentially non-functional as a parent, leaving Jason to care for her rather than receiving care. But Willis's disappearance eliminated even the occasional adult intervention that had previously provided moments of stability. Catherine's death followed with the inevitable logic of untreated addiction, combined with poverty and isolation. Her overdose was neither sudden nor unexpected, the culmination of years of physical and psychological deterioration that Jason had witnessed with the helpless clarity of someone too young to intervene effectively, but old enough to understand the trajectory toward tragedy. The boy's discovery of her lifeless form served as his final education in the absolute indifference of urban decay toward individual suffering and loss. The official response to Catherine's death exemplified the bureaucratic callousness that characterized Gotham's treatment of its most vulnerable residents. Social services conducted their perfunctory investigation, filed their required reports, and moved on to the next case, without providing meaningful assistance to the newly orphaned child who had been left to navigate the system's labyrinthine requirements alone. The foster care placement that should have provided safety and stability instead introduced Jason to new forms of institutional neglect and exploitation. The facility that became his temporary home operated according to principles that prioritized efficiency and cost control over the welfare of the children, theoretically under its protection. Overcrowding, understaffing, and inadequate supervision created an environment where the strong preyed upon the weak with systematic regularity, while adults either remained oblivious to the abuse or chose to ignore it, rather than confront problems that would require additional resources to address effectively. Jason's survival within this institutional setting required the application of every skill he had learned during his years on Crime Alley's streets, plus the development of new capabilities suited to the particular challenges of group living under minimal adult supervision. He learned to form strategic alliances with other residents, to identify and avoid the most dangerous predators among both children and staff, to navigate the unwritten rules that govern daily life in ways that maximized his access to food, safety, and privacy. The education he received during this period came not from formal instruction, which remained sporadic and inadequate, but from exposure to children who had survived experiences that rivaled or exceeded his own in terms of trauma and loss. Their stories provided him with a broader understanding of the ways that society systematically failed its most vulnerable members while maintaining the pretense of concern and protection. The casual brutality of institutional life served as preparation for his later encounters with Gotham's criminal underworld, teaching him to recognize and respond to threats while maintaining the emotional detachment necessary for survival. The decision to leave official care and return to the streets represented Jason's conscious choice of known dangers over unknown ones, a calculated risk based on his assessment that his survival skills were better suited to the familiar challenges of Crime Alley than to the alien environment of institutional supervision. His departure was neither dramatic nor particularly noticed by the overworked staff who were responsible for tracking the whereabouts of dozens of children with minimal resources and less genuine concern. The return to independent life on Gotham's streets marked the beginning of Jason's career as a professional thief, though his criminal activities were motivated by survival necessity rather than greed or excitement. His small size and natural agility made him ideally suited for certain types of theft, particularly those involving access to confined spaces or situations requiring speed and stealth rather than strength or intimidation. The skills he had learned from observing Willis's activities, combined with new techniques acquired from other street children, provided him with a comprehensive education in criminal methodology. His specialization in automotive theft, particularly the lucrative market for specialized tires and parts, reflected both practical considerations about risk and reward, and his intuitive understanding of which crimes were likely to attract serious law enforcement attention versus those that fell below the threshold of official concern. The theft of luxury car components offered substantial financial returns, while targeting victims who possessed both insurance coverage and the resources to absorb losses without significant personal hardship. The moral framework that Jason developed during this period of criminal self-sufficiency was necessarily pragmatic, based on immediate survival needs rather than abstract ethical principles. He learned to distinguish between crimes that harmed genuinely vulnerable victims versus those that affected only the wealthy or institutions capable of absorbing losses without meaningful impact. His natural empathy prevented him from engaging in activities that would directly harm individuals who shared his own vulnerability, while his anger at social inequality made him feel little guilt about taking from those who possessed far more than they needed. The territory he claimed for his operations included some of Crime Alley's most dangerous neighborhoods, areas where legitimate businesses had long since fled, and where police patrols remained infrequent and ineffective. His knowledge of the local geography, gained through years of residence and exploration, provided him with advantages that compensated for his youth and limited physical strength. He knew which buildings offered secure hiding places, which routes provided the fastest escape from pursuit, which residents could be trusted to ignore illegal activities in exchange for small considerations. His reputation among other street children grew through his demonstrated competence and his willingness to share information and resources with those who showed him loyalty and respect. The informal networks that connected Gotham's homeless youth operated according to principles of mutual aid and collective defense that provided alternatives to the brutal competition that characterized adult criminal enterprises. Jason's position within these networks reflected his natural leadership abilities and his understanding that cooperation often served individual interests better than pure selfishness. The adults who inhabited Crime Alley's criminal ecosystem initially viewed Jason as just another expendable resource, a small-time operator whose activities were too insignificant to warrant serious attention from established power structures. This dismissive attitude provided him with a form of protection, allowing him to develop his skills and build his reputation without triggering the violent responses that typically greeted more ambitious criminal enterprises. His youth also generated a certain amount of sympathy and protectiveness from individuals who retained enough humanity to feel uncomfortable about the systematic exploitation of children. The education he received during this period included lessons in violence and intimidation that would prove essential during his later career as both Robin and Red Hood. The streets taught him to recognize the signs of impending physical confrontation, to assess opponents' strengths and weaknesses quickly, to understand when negotiation was possible and when only force would resolve conflicts. His small size made him vulnerable in direct physical confrontations, encouraging the development of strategic thinking and tactical awareness that emphasized preparation and positioning over raw strength. The weapons training he received was necessarily informal and practical, focused on tools that were readily available and easily concealed, rather than exotic equipment, requiring specialized knowledge or significant financial investment. He learned to use everyday objects as improvised weapons, to recognize and exploit environmental advantages, to understand the psychological dimensions of violence that often proved more important than purely physical considerations. The knowledge that he might need to defend his life at any moment created a constant state of alertness that would serve him well during his later adventures. Margun's School for Boys represented both an opportunity for improved living conditions and a new form of exploitation that was more systematic and sophisticated than anything Jason had previously encountered. The facility presented itself as a charitable institution devoted to providing education and stability for Gotham's homeless youth, yet its actual purpose involved the recruitment and training of child criminals, whose activities generated substantial profits for the adults who controlled their operations. The deception was sophisticated enough to fool casual observation and even cursory official inspection, with genuine educational activities and apparent concern for the boys' welfare serving as cover for the criminal training that constituted the institution's true purpose. The staff included individuals who possessed both legitimate teaching credentials and extensive experience in various criminal enterprises, allowing them to provide instruction that served the facility's illegal objectives while maintaining the appearance of conventional education. Jason's initial reaction to the school environment was cautious optimism, as the promise of regular meals, safe sleeping arrangements, and structured activities represented significant improvements over his recent living conditions. The dormitory housing provided privacy and security that had been absent from his street existence. While the communal dining facilities offered both nutritional stability and social interaction with peers who shared similar backgrounds and experiences. The gradual revelation of the institution's true nature came through observations that initially seemed innocuous, but accumulated into undeniable evidence of systematic criminal activity. The advanced courses in electronics that focused primarily on alarm systems and security bypassing. The mathematics lessons that emphasized profit calculations for illegal enterprises. The physical education programs that included instruction in stealth movement and lockpicking, all contributed to an educational curriculum that was designed to produce competent criminals rather than productive citizens. The other boys who populated the facility represented a cross-section of Gotham's abandoned and exploited youth, each carrying his own history of trauma and survival, while adapting to the peculiar combination of stability and corruption that characterized their current situation. Their backgrounds provided Jason with insights into the various paths that could lead children into criminal activity, from family involvement in illegal enterprises to systematic abuse within official institutions, to simple economic desperation that made illegal activity the only viable means of survival. The relationships he formed with his fellow residents were complicated by the competitive atmosphere that the staff deliberately fostered, encouraging the boys to view each other as rivals for advancement within the criminal hierarchy, rather than allies united by shared circumstances and common interests. The institution's structure rewarded individual achievement in criminal activities while discouraging the formation of bonds that might lead to collective resistance or escape attempts. Jason's natural leadership abilities and superior street experience quickly established him as an unofficial leader among his age cohort, a position that brought both advantages and additional scrutiny from the adult supervisors, who recognized his potential value as a recruitment tool, while also identifying him as a possible threat to their control. His influence over other boys made him valuable for maintaining discipline and encouraging participation in criminal activities, yet his demonstrated independence and critical thinking abilities raised concerns about his long-term reliability as an asset. The criminal activities that the boys were required to perform began with relatively minor theft and gradually escalated to more serious crimes as they demonstrated competence and loyalty to the organization. The progression was carefully managed to ensure that each child became progressively more invested in the criminal enterprise, while also accumulating legal vulnerabilities that would make cooperation with law enforcement increasingly unlikely, even if the opportunity arose. Jason's participation in these activities was motivated primarily by his desire to maintain his position within the facility while gathering information about the organization's structure and vulnerabilities. His street experience had taught him to be suspicious of adults who offered help without obvious benefit to themselves, and his observations confirmed that Margun's generosity was conditional upon the boy's willingness to serve her illegal objectives rather than their actual welfare or development. The decision to reject the school's criminal programming and return to independent street life represented Jason's conscious choice of familiar dangers over systematic exploitation, a calculated determination that his own moral development and long-term survival were better served by honest criminal activity, motivated by necessity, rather than participation in an organized enterprise that sought to profit from the systematic corruption of children. His departure was neither dramatic nor particularly noticed by staff who were accustomed to occasional departures and focused primarily on maintaining their operations rather than tracking individual residents. The return to Crime Alley's streets marked the beginning of the final phase of Jason's independent criminal career, a period characterized by increased sophistication in his methods and growing confidence in his abilities. His experience within Margun's organization had provided him with advanced techniques and broader understanding of criminal enterprise, while also reinforcing his determination to maintain his independence and moral autonomy despite the practical advantages of organizational membership. His specialization in tire theft represented both practical expertise and symbolic rejection of the systematic approach to crime that Margun had attempted to impose upon him. The choice to focus on a particular type of theft that he had mastered independently reflected his desire to succeed through his own abilities rather than through participation in enterprises controlled by adults who viewed him as expendable resource rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration. The territory he claimed for his operations had expanded to include some of Gotham's more affluent neighborhoods, areas where the potential rewards justified the increased risks, while the victims possessed the resources to absorb losses without genuine hardship. His selection of targets reflected both practical considerations about security and escape routes, and his developing moral framework that sought to minimize harm to individuals who shared his own vulnerability while focusing criminal activity on those who possessed substantial advantages in terms of wealth and social position. The reputation he developed among Gotham's criminal community during this period was that of a competent and reliable independent operator who could be trusted to complete assignments without drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement or creating complications for other criminal enterprises. His youth continued to provide certain advantages in terms of reduced suspicion and lighter potential legal consequences, while his demonstrated skills and growing experience earned him respect that transcended his chronological age. The skills he developed during this final period of criminal activity would prove essential during his later career as Robin, though neither he nor Batman would initially recognize the connections between his street education and his potential as a crime fighter. The observational abilities that allowed him to identify vulnerable targets and avoid police patrols would later enable him to gather intelligence about criminal activities and anticipate villains' strategies. The stealth and agility that made him effective at theft would serve him well during reconnaissance and infiltration missions. The understanding of criminal psychology that he had gained through years of survival would provide him with insights that complemented Batman's more formal training and education. The night that would change everything began like countless others, with Jason conducting routine surveillance of potential targets in one of Gotham's more affluent districts. His selection of the particular vehicle that would alter the course of his life was based on standard criteria involving accessibility, value of components, and likelihood of successful escape, rather than any awareness of the vehicle's significance or its owner's identity. The Batmobile's presence in that location at that time represented the intersection of destiny and coincidence that would transform a street thief into one of the most complex and controversial heroes in Gotham's history. The fateful encounter that would forever alter the trajectory of both Bruce Wayne's mission and Jason Todd's destiny occurred on a night when Gotham's shadows seemed deeper than usual, when the city's perpetual fog carried with it whispers of change and transformation that neither participant could have anticipated or understood. It was the anniversary of Thomas and Martha Wayne's murder, that sacred date when Bruce invariably conducted his most solitary patrol through the streets where his own childhood had died in a hail of gunfire and spilled pearls, where every alleyway held echoes of the tragedy that had forged him into something greater and more terrible than an ordinary man. The ritual of this annual pilgrimage had evolved over the years into a complex ceremony of remembrance and renewal, a private communion with the ghosts of his past that required absolute solitude and complete focus on the memories that sustained his crusade against the forces of chaos and criminality. Batman's patrol route on this particular night followed the same path he had walked as an 8-year-old boy, retracing the steps that had led his family from the bright lights of the theater district into the darkness of Crime Alley, where innocence had been murdered and purpose had been born from the ashes of a shattered childhood. The conversation with Margun had been brief but illuminating, one of those chance encounters that revealed more about Gotham's hidden networks of care and corruption than months of detective work might accomplish. The woman's dedication to the children under her supervision appeared genuine, her concern for their welfare authentic, yet something in her manner suggested complexities that warranted further investigation. Batman filed away mental notes about her operation while continuing his patrol, unaware that his assessment of her character would prove both accurate and incomplete, in ways that would soon become devastatingly apparent. The discovery of the missing tire from the Batmobile represented more than simple theft. It constituted a violation of the sacred ritual that this night represented, an intrusion of mundane criminality into the sanctified space of memory and mourning that Batman had created through years of solitary observance. Yet the audacity of the crime also provoked something approaching admiration, for the thief had managed to identify and exploit a moment of vulnerability that even Gotham's most dangerous criminals had never dared to attempt. The laughter that escaped Batman's lips was perhaps the first genuine expression of amusement he had experienced in Crime Alley since childhood, a sound so foreign to that place that it seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the street. The return of the tire thief represented either remarkable boldness or spectacular stupidity, though Batman's initial assessment leaned toward the latter interpretation, until the tire iron struck him with precision that spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The blow was delivered with sufficient force to demonstrate serious intent, while avoiding the kind of damage that would indicate homicidal purpose, a distinction that suggested the attacker possessed both physical capability and moral restraint that were unusual combinations in Gotham's criminal population. The boy who emerged from the shadows wielding his improvised weapon was a study in contradictions that immediately captured Batman's analytical attention. Jason Todd's appearance spoke to months or perhaps years of life on the streets, yet his movements demonstrated training and discipline that exceeded what casual observation of criminal techniques might provide. His clothing was worn and patched but clean, his posture alert but not defensive in the manner of someone accustomed to constant threat, his expression wary, yet curious, rather than filled with the desperate fear that characterized most children who found themselves confronting Gotham's legendary vigilante. The epithet that Jason hurled at Batman carried with it layers of meaning that revealed more about the boy's background and psychology than a formal interrogation might have accomplished. The choice of boob as an insult was simultaneously childish and sophisticated, suggesting someone who possessed extensive vocabulary but deliberately selected terms that minimized rather than escalated confrontation. This linguistic choice implied tactical thinking and emotional intelligence that were remarkable in someone so young, qualities that Batman recognized as potentially valuable assets if properly developed and channeled toward constructive purposes. The pursuit that followed Jason's escape provided Batman with additional opportunities to assess the boy's capabilities and character through direct observation of his movement patterns, decision-making processes, and responses to pressure. Jason's route through Crime Alley's labyrinthine passages demonstrated intimate knowledge of local geography, combined with strategic thinking that maximized his advantages while minimizing Batman's superior physical capabilities. The boy chose pathways that favored agility over strength, stealth over speed, intelligence over raw power, revealing a tactical mind that understood how to leverage limited resources against superior opposition. The building that served as Jason's refuge was itself a testament to the systematic neglect that characterized Gotham's approach to its most vulnerable populations. The structure's deteriorating infrastructure provided numerous entry and exit points, while offering concealment opportunities that could frustrate even sophisticated surveillance techniques. Batman's infiltration required careful attention to structural integrity and noise discipline, skills that had been honed through years of similar operations, but which were tested by the building's unpredictable architecture and Jason's obvious familiarity with its hidden passages and defensive positions. The living conditions that Batman discovered within Jason's makeshift home provided stark evidence of the boy's resilience and resourcefulness, while also revealing the harsh realities of independent survival in one of Gotham's most dangerous neighborhoods. The space had been modified with considerable skill to provide security, comfort, and functionality despite its obvious limitations, and the absence of basic amenities that most people considered essential for human habitation. Makeshift furniture, constructed from salvaged materials, demonstrated both practical intelligence and aesthetic sensibility, while improvised security measures revealed understanding of urban warfare principles that exceeded what most adults possessed. The drug paraphernalia that Batman observed during his initial survey of the premises provided context for his harsh assessment of Jason's living situation, though subsequent investigation would reveal that appearances could be misleading and that assumptions based on limited evidence might not accurately reflect the complex realities of street life. The presence of such materials in a space occupied by a minor automatically triggered Batman's protective instincts, while also raising questions about the boy's involvement in activities that could have serious legal and health consequences. The confrontation over Jason's living arrangements became a philosophical debate conducted through action rather than words, as Batman's obvious disapproval met with Jason's defensive anger and wounded pride. The boy's reaction to criticism of his lifestyle revealed both emotional vulnerability and fierce independence, suggesting someone who had been forced to assume adult responsibilities while retaining the psychological needs and perspectives of childhood. His anger was proportional and focused, rather than explosive and random, indicating emotional regulation skills that were remarkable given his circumstances and apparent lack of adult guidance or support. Batman's decision to remove Jason from his current living situation represented both practical concern for the boy's immediate welfare and strategic recognition that such obvious talent and determination could be channeled toward more constructive purposes if provided with appropriate guidance and opportunities. The intervention was conducted with minimal discussion or negotiation, reflecting Batman's tendency to make unilateral decisions based on his assessment of optimal outcomes rather than consulting with the individuals most directly affected by his choices. The enrollment at Margun's school represented what appeared to be an ideal solution to Jason's immediate needs, while also providing Batman with opportunities to monitor the boy's development and adaptation to more structured living arrangements. The institution's reputation for working with difficult cases and providing comprehensive support services made it seem perfectly suited for someone with Jason's background and demonstrated capabilities. The placement was arranged with the efficiency that characterized all of Batman's logistical operations, yet neither he nor Jason initially recognized the complexities and hidden dangers that lurked beneath the school's benevolent facade. The revelation of Margun's true nature and criminal objectives transformed what should have been a rescue into a more complex moral and tactical challenge that tested both Batman's detective skills and Jason's capacity for independent moral reasoning. The woman's exploitation of vulnerable children under the guise of charitable assistance represented exactly the kind of systematic abuse of power that Batman's mission had been designed to combat, yet her methods were sufficiently sophisticated to avoid detection by official oversight mechanisms that should have provided protection for her charges. The criminal curriculum that Margun had developed represented a perverse inversion of legitimate educational principles, using proven pedagogical techniques to transmit knowledge and skills that served illegal rather than socially beneficial purposes. Her lessons in firearms handling, electronic surveillance, financial fraud, and interpersonal manipulation were professionally competent and practically effective, suggesting genuine expertise in both criminal methodology and educational psychology. The combination made her operation particularly dangerous because it produced graduates who were genuinely skilled rather than merely desperate. Jason's exposure to this systematic criminal training provided him with capabilities that would prove invaluable during his later career as Robin, though neither he nor Batman initially recognized the connections between illegal techniques and legitimate crime-fighting applications. The lock-picking skills that were intended to enable burglary would later facilitate infiltration of criminal strongholds. The weapons handling that was meant to prepare him for armed robbery would contribute to his effectiveness in confronting dangerous opponents. The understanding of criminal psychology that emerged from first-hand participation in illegal enterprises would provide insights that complemented Batman's more theoretical knowledge. The other children who populated Ma Gunn's facility represented a cross-section of Gotham's abandoned and exploited youth, each carrying individual histories of trauma and survival, while adapting to the peculiar combination of stability and corruption that characterized their current situation. Their stories provided Jason with broader understanding of the various paths that could lead minors into criminal activity, from family involvement in illegal enterprises, to systematic abuse within official institutions, to simple economic desperation that made illegal alternatives the only viable means of survival. Jason's natural leadership abilities quickly established him as an influential figure among his age cohort, a position that brought both advantages and additional scrutiny from adult supervisors, who recognized his potential value while also identifying him as a possible threat to their control. His demonstrated independence and critical thinking abilities raised concerns about his long-term reliability. Yet, his influence over other students made him valuable for maintaining discipline and encouraging participation in criminal activities. The decision to reject Ma Gunn's criminal programming represented Jason's conscious choice to maintain his moral autonomy despite the practical advantages of organizational membership and structured support. His departure was motivated not by fear of criminal activity, which his street experience had already normalized, but by recognition that systematic exploitation of children crossed ethical boundaries that he was unwilling to accept regardless of personal benefit. The investigation that led to Ma Gunn's exposure and arrest demonstrated Jason's capacity for independent moral reasoning and his willingness to take significant personal risks in service of protecting other vulnerable individuals. His decision to provide information to Batman required overcoming both his natural distrust of adult authority figures and his learned skepticism about the effectiveness of official intervention in situations involving systematic abuse of power. The choice represented a leap of faith that would establish the foundation for their future relationship. Batman's response to Jason's information revealed aspects of his character that the boy had not previously observed, including genuine compassion for exploited children and righteous anger toward adults who abused positions of trust and authority. The efficiency with which Batman dismantled Ma Gunn's operation demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything Jason had witnessed during their previous encounters, providing evidence of resources and connections that operated far beyond the level of conventional law enforcement. The arrest of Ma Gunn and her associates created immediate practical problems for the children who had been living within her facility, as the destruction of their illegal support system left them without housing, income, or adult supervision, while official alternatives remained inadequate to address their complex needs. Jason's situation was particularly complicated because his demonstrated involvement in exposing the criminal operation made him both a valuable witness and a potential target for retaliation from Margun's criminal associates. Batman's decision to take direct responsibility for Jason's welfare represented a significant departure from his usual practice of maintaining emotional distance from the individuals affected by his crime-fighting activities. The choice was motivated by practical concerns about the boy's immediate safety, combined with growing recognition that Jason possessed qualities that might make him valuable as more than simply another rescued victim requiring placement within Gotham's inadequate social services system. The 6 months of training that followed represented an unprecedented experiment in Batman's operational methodology, as he had never before attempted to prepare someone so young for participation in activities that routinely involved life-threatening danger. The curriculum he developed drew upon his own training experiences while acknowledging the significant differences between adult and adolescent learning patterns, physical capabilities, and psychological development. The program required constant adjustment, as Jason's rapid progress exceeded initial expectations, while also revealing areas where additional preparation was necessary. The physical conditioning component of Jason's training focused on developing strength, speed, and agility, while also building the kind of endurance that would enable sustained performance during extended operations. The exercises were adapted from military and athletic training protocols, but modified to accommodate Jason's age and current fitness level, while pushing him toward capabilities that would enable effective participation in Batman's mission. The progression was carefully monitored to prevent injury while maintaining the intensity necessary for rapid improvement. The combat training represented perhaps the most controversial aspect of Jason's preparation, as it involved teaching lethal techniques to someone who was still legally and psychologically a child. Batman's approach emphasized defensive applications and non-lethal alternatives, while ensuring that Jason possessed the skills necessary to survive encounters with opponents who would not show similar restraint. The training included both armed and unarmed combat, though Batman's personal aversion to firearms meant that weapons instruction focused primarily on traditional implements and improvised tools. The detective skills component of the training curriculum drew upon Batman's extensive experience in investigation and analysis, while adapting complex methodologies for someone whose formal education had been limited and unconventional. Jason's natural observational abilities and street-acquired understanding of human behavior provided an excellent foundation for more sophisticated techniques involving evidence collection, logical deduction, and behavioral analysis. His progress in this area was particularly rapid, suggesting innate capabilities that complemented his learned skills. The technological training focused on equipment operation and basic maintenance rather than advanced engineering or computer programming, reflecting Batman's recognition that Jason's role would emphasize field operations rather than technical support. The boy learned to operate communication systems, surveillance equipment, and various specialized tools while developing sufficient understanding of their principles to perform routine maintenance and minor repairs. His mechanical aptitude proved considerably greater than anticipated, suggesting potential for more advanced technical training if circumstances warranted. The psychological preparation for life as Robin represented perhaps the most challenging aspect of Jason's training, as it required helping him develop emotional resilience and moral clarity, while maintaining the empathy and compassion that made him effective at connecting with victims and witnesses. Batman's own psychological development had been shaped by trauma and isolation in ways that provided limited guidance for nurturing healthy emotional growth in someone else. Yet, he recognized that Jason's effectiveness would depend upon maintaining humanity rather than embracing the kind of detachment that characterized his own approach to crime fighting. The academic education that supplemented Jason's practical training addressed gaps in his formal knowledge, while also providing cultural literacy that would enable him to function effectively in various social environments. The curriculum included history, literature, languages, and sciences, though the emphasis remained on practical applications rather than theoretical understanding. Jason's natural intelligence made him a rapid learner, though his unconventional background sometimes led to unexpected insights that challenged conventional approaches to familiar subjects. Alfred's role in Jason's development extended far beyond simple logistics and medical support to encompass the kind of emotional, nurturing, and moral guidance that Batman was temperamentally unable to provide. The butler's concern for Jason's welfare reflected both his natural compassion for children and his intimate understanding of the psychological costs that Batman's mission imposed upon everyone who participated in it. His quiet opposition to involving another child in such dangerous activities was expressed through careful attention to Jason's emotional needs and persistent advocacy for normal childhood experiences whenever circumstances permitted. The gradual integration of Jason into Wayne Manor's daily routines represented a complex negotiation between the demands of his training and the requirements of maintaining Bruce Wayne's public persona. The boy's presence required explanations to staff and visitors, while also creating new security considerations that had not been necessary when Batman's operation remained entirely separate from Bruce Wayne's civilian life. The challenge of maintaining these separate identities while ensuring Jason's emotional and social development required constant attention and occasional improvisation. The fitting of Jason's Robin costume marked the culmination of his physical preparation and the beginning of his psychological transformation into Batman's partner. The suit incorporated improved protective features based on lessons learned during Dick Grayson's tenure, while also reflecting Jason's smaller size and different movement patterns. The symbolic significance of the costume was carefully explained, ensuring that Jason understood both the honor and the responsibility that the Robin identity represented within Batman's mission and Gotham's ongoing struggle against criminal chaos. The selection of Jason's first official mission as Robin reflected Batman's desire to provide meaningful but manageable challenges that would build confidence while testing the effectiveness of the training program. The target was chosen for its operational significance and relative safety rather than dramatic impact, though the encounter with the Joker that resulted from this decision would prove far more dangerous and psychologically significant than either Batman or Jason had anticipated. The night of Jason's debut as Robin began with the kind of routine patrol that had characterized thousands of similar evenings. Yet the presence of a new partner fundamentally altered the dynamics of Batman's operations in ways that would take time to fully understand and appreciate. Jason's enthusiasm and fresh perspective brought energy and optimism to activities that had become mechanical and solitary, while his different approach to problem-solving provided alternative solutions to familiar challenges. The partnership promised mutual benefits that extended beyond simple tactical advantages to encompass emotional and psychological dimensions that Batman had not experienced since Dick Grayson's departure. The encounter with the Joker served as an immediate and severe test of Jason's preparation and Batman's judgment in bringing another child into his war against Gotham's criminal elements. The confrontation revealed both Jason's capabilities and his limitations, while also demonstrating the unique psychological challenges that the Joker presented for anyone who sought to oppose him through conventional means. The success of the mission provided validation for Batman's training methods, while also highlighting areas where additional preparation would be necessary before Jason could safely face the full spectrum of threats that characterized life as Robin. The aftermath of Jason's successful debut created a sense of optimism and possibility that had been absent from Batman's operations for months, suggesting that the partnership might indeed provide benefits that justified the considerable risks and emotional investment required. Alfred's grudging acknowledgement of Jason's performance reflected his recognition that the boy possessed genuine potential despite his own continuing concerns about the wisdom of involving children in such dangerous activities. The foundation had been laid for what might become one of the most significant partnerships in Batman's crusade, though future events would reveal complexities and challenges that no amount of preparation could entirely prevent. The transformation of Jason Todd from eager apprentice to angry warrior began not with a single catastrophic event, but through the gradual accumulation of experiences that challenged his fundamental beliefs about justice, heroism, and the nature of evil itself. The early months of his partnership with Batman had been marked by victories that seemed to validate the righteousness of their cause and the effectiveness of their methods. Yet each successful mission also exposed him to aspects of Gotham's criminal underworld that his street education had only partially prepared him to understand or accept. The revolving door of Arkham Asylum became a source of increasing frustration for Jason as he witnessed the same dangerous criminals repeatedly escape, commit new atrocities, and return to their cells in an endless cycle that seemed to mock the sacrifices made by those who risked their lives to capture them. The mathematical certainty of this pattern was undeniable. For every villain they apprehended, innocent people would suffer and die during the inevitable period between escape and recapture. The knowledge that their efforts provided only temporary respite rather than permanent protection created a gnawing sense of futility that grew stronger with each mission. His first encounter with the Joker as Robin had been thrilling in its successful conclusion. Yet, subsequent meetings with Batman's most persistent nemesis revealed the true scope of the madman's influence and the inadequacy of conventional justice in addressing threats that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior. The Joker's complete immunity to rehabilitation, his gleeful embrace of chaos and suffering, his ability to corrupt and destroy everything he touched, all served as evidence that some forms of evil could not be contained through the humanitarian principles that governed Batman's approach to crime fighting. The psychological profile of the Joker that Jason compiled through careful observation and analysis revealed a mind that had moved beyond mere insanity into something approaching pure malevolence, a consciousness that derived genuine pleasure from the suffering of others and viewed the creation of tragedy as an art form worthy of lifelong dedication. The clown's victims were not merely obstacles to his criminal enterprises, but raw materials for experiments in human anguish that served no purpose beyond the satisfaction of his twisted aesthetics. The relationship between Batman and the Joker struck Jason as fundamentally dysfunctional, a codependent dynamic in which the hero's commitment to preserving his enemy's life enabled increasingly elaborate and deadly schemes that claimed innocent victims with predictable regularity. Batman's refusal to acknowledge this pattern, his insistence that killing the Joker would represent a moral failure greater than allowing him to continue murdering, seemed to Jason like a form of philosophical vanity that prioritized abstract principles over concrete human lives. The case that crystallized Jason's growing disillusionment with Batman's methods involved a serial killer who preyed upon children, selecting victims whose disappearances were unlikely to trigger intensive police investigations or media attention. The perpetrator's careful targeting of runaways, homeless youth, and children from broken families demonstrated both calculated cruelty and intimate understanding of which lives society considered expendable. His ability to continue operating for years without serious interference from law enforcement revealed systematic failures that extended far beyond individual incompetence or resource limitations. The investigation that led to the killer's capture required months of patient detective work, during which additional children disappeared and were presumably murdered, while Batman insisted on gathering sufficient evidence to ensure successful prosecution through legitimate channels. Jason's suggestion that they could end the threat immediately through direct action was rejected not on tactical grounds but on moral ones, as Batman maintained that preserving the integrity of the justice system was more important than preventing specific deaths that might result from bureaucratic delays. The trial that followed the killer's arrest became a textbook example of everything that was wrong with Gotham's legal system, as procedural technicalities, corrupt officials, and inadequate resources combined to create reasonable doubt where none should have existed. The defendant's expensive legal team successfully argued that key evidence had been obtained through illegal means, that witness testimony was unreliable due to the traumatic nature of their experiences, and that their client was himself a victim of mental illness, deserving treatment rather than punishment. The acquittal that resulted from these legal maneuvers was celebrated by civil liberties advocates as a victory for constitutional principles and due process rights. Yet Jason could think only of the families who would never see their children again, and the future victims who would suffer because the system had prioritized procedural correctness over substantive justice. The killer's smug satisfaction as he walked free from the courtroom, his obvious anticipation of resuming his predatory activities, crystallized Jason's growing conviction that Batman's moral code was inadequately equipped to address the realities of evil in its most persistent and dangerous forms. The resumption of killings that began within weeks of the acquittal followed the same pattern that had characterized the perpetrator's previous activities, yet law enforcement agencies seemed powerless to intervene effectively despite knowing his identity and methods. The legal doctrine of double jeopardy prevented new prosecution for crimes that had already been adjudicated, while the requirement for fresh evidence to support new charges created investigative burdens that overwhelmed available resources and expertise. Jason's proposal that they circumvent these legal obstacles through direct action was met with increasingly heated arguments from Batman, who insisted that abandoning the rule of law would make them no different from the criminals they opposed. The philosophical debate that raged between them during long nights in the Batcave revealed fundamental differences in their understanding of justice, morality, and the relationship between means and ends that could not be resolved through rational discourse or mutual compromise. The turning point came when the killer claimed another victim, a 9-year-old girl whose disappearance from a playground in broad daylight demonstrated both his growing boldness and his complete contempt for the legal system that had failed to stop him. The child's body was discovered days later, in a location clearly chosen to maximize the psychological impact on her family and the investigating officers, positioned and mutilated in ways that served no purpose beyond the killer's sadistic satisfaction. The crime scene photographs that Jason studied with detective's thoroughness revealed levels of cruelty that challenged his ability to maintain emotional equilibrium while processing evidence objectively. The systematic torture that had preceded the child's death, the deliberate prolonging of her suffering, the mocking messages left for investigators to discover, all pointed to a perpetrator who had transcended conventional criminal motivation to embrace evil as an artistic expression deserving of recognition and appreciation. Batman's response to this latest atrocity was to redouble his efforts to build a legal case that could withstand appellate scrutiny, gathering evidence with even greater care and methodical precision, while the killer continued to operate with apparent impunity. The hero's dedication to proper procedure struck Jason as criminally negligent, a form of moral cowardice disguised as ethical sophistication that enabled continued atrocities through inaction, masquerading as principled restraint. The confrontation that finally brought Jason face to face with his first genuine moral crisis occurred when their investigation led them to the killer's lair during the commission of another abduction. The discovery of the perpetrator in the act of restraining his latest victim, a boy who could not have been older than 7, created an immediate tactical situation that demanded decisive action to prevent another murder while also preserving evidence necessary for successful prosecution. The killer's response to their intervention was neither surrender nor flight, but rather an attempt to murder his captive victim as a final act of defiance against those who sought to interfere with his artistic vision. The knife that descended toward the child's throat was intercepted by Jason's precisely thrown batarang, yet the proximity of death to innocence created a moment of crystalline clarity that revealed the absolute inadequacy of reactive justice in protecting those who needed protection most desperately. Batman's successful subdual of the perpetrator was accomplished with the same non-lethal techniques that had characterized all their previous encounters with dangerous criminals. Yet Jason found himself wondering what would have happened if their timing had been slightly different, if their intervention had come seconds later, if the child had died while they debated proper procedure and constitutional niceties. The randomness of the successful outcome, its dependence upon factors beyond their control rather than the inherent rightness of their methods, struck him as unacceptable from both practical and moral perspectives. The rescue of the potential victim provided temporary satisfaction, yet Jason's relief was tempered by the knowledge that the legal system would likely fail again, that procedural challenges and constitutional protections would enable the killer to escape permanent punishment while retaining both the freedom and the inclination to resume his predatory activities. The child they had saved would recover from his physical ordeal, yet other children would die because society lacked the moral courage to eliminate threats that could never be reformed or contained. The killer's subsequent trial followed the same pattern that had characterized his previous prosecution, as defense attorneys exploited technicalities and procedural requirements to create doubt and delay, while their client demonstrated complete absence of remorse or reform. His testimony revealed not only his intention to resume killing upon his expected release, but also detailed descriptions of tortures he planned to inflict upon future victims, confessions that were inadmissible as evidence yet served to confirm Jason's assessment of his irredeemable nature. The acquittal that resulted from prosecutorial errors and judicial incompetence was anticipated by everyone involved in the case. Yet Jason experienced it as a personal failure that reflected not only the inadequacy of legal institutions, but also his own complicity in perpetuating a system that prioritized the rights of predators over the safety of potential victims. His growing anger was directed not only at the killer and his legal representatives, but also at Batman, whose insistence on working within a fundamentally broken system enabled continued atrocities through principled inaction. The confrontation between Jason and Batman that followed the killer's release revealed depths of philosophical disagreement that neither had previously acknowledged or addressed directly. Jason's argument that some individuals forfeited their right to life through their actions was met with Batman's counter-argument that society's commitment to human dignity required protecting even those who demonstrated no reciprocal respect for others' lives. The debate encompassed questions about the nature of justice, the purpose of law enforcement, and the moral obligations of those who possessed the power to prevent future crimes through decisive action. Batman's explanation of his refusal to kill focused on the corrupting influence of taking life and the impossibility of returning from moral compromises that seemed reasonable in specific circumstances, but established precedents for increasingly problematic decisions. His concern was not only about his own psychological welfare, but also about the example he set for others, the message that vigilante killing sent about the rule of law, and the practical consequences of establishing himself as judge, jury, and executioner in a society already struggling to maintain democratic institutions. Jason's response challenged these concerns with arguments rooted in utilitarian calculation and practical ethics that prioritized results over process, outcomes over methods, the prevention of future harm over abstract philosophical consistency. His position was that Batman's moral purity was purchased at the cost of innocent lives, that his commitment to non-lethal methods was a luxury that society could not afford when facing threats that transcended conventional categories of criminal behavior. The case of Felipe Garzonas represented the culmination of Jason's growing frustration with legal systems that seemed designed to protect perpetrators rather than victims, constitutional principles that prioritized procedural correctness over substantive justice, and Batman's unwillingness to acknowledge that some situations required solutions that transcended conventional moral categories. The young diplomat's immunity from prosecution, despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes, created a perfect storm of legal inadequacy and moral outrage that tested every principle that governed their approach to crime fighting. Gloria Stanson's initial reluctance to report her assault reflected both personal trauma and rational assessment of the legal system's inability to provide either justice or protection for victims who lacked social status and political connections. Her eventual cooperation with law enforcement demonstrated courage that was rewarded with additional victimization by defense attorneys, who portrayed her as an unreliable witness motivated by vindictiveness rather than desire for justice. The systematic destruction of her credibility and reputation served Felipe's legal interests while also deterring other potential victims from seeking help through official channels. The investigation that documented Felipe's criminal activities revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that extended across multiple jurisdictions and involved victims who were carefully selected for their vulnerability and isolation. The diplomat's understanding of legal technicalities and international law enabled him to structure his crimes in ways that exploited jurisdictional boundaries, procedural requirements, and diplomatic protocols to avoid accountability while maximizing opportunities for continued predation. The evidence that Jason and Batman compiled would have been sufficient to convict any ordinary citizen, yet Felipe's diplomatic status created an impermeable legal barrier that rendered even the most compelling proof irrelevant to formal prosecution. The disconnect between moral certainty and legal possibility created a situation that challenged fundamental assumptions about justice, law enforcement, and the relationship between power and accountability in democratic societies. Jason's growing obsession with the case reflected not only his natural empathy for victims, but also his increasing conviction that Batman's methods were inadequately equipped to address systemic failures that enabled continued atrocities through legal rather than criminal means. The impossibility of achieving justice through conventional channels demanded alternative approaches that Batman's moral code explicitly prohibited, creating an irreconcilable conflict between principle and pragmatism that could not be resolved through compromise or delay. The night of Gloria's death marked the point of no return in Jason's psychological development, transforming theoretical disagreements about methods and philosophy into personal rage that demanded expression regardless of consequences or approval from authority figures. The discovery of her body, suspended from a ceiling beam in a position that maximized the visual impact of her final despair, created an image that would haunt his dreams and fuel his anger for years to come. The suicide note that Gloria left behind explicitly blamed Felipe for her death while also expressing her certainty that official channels would never provide either justice or protection from his continued predation. Her decision to end her own life, rather than endure the prospect of renewed victimization, served as the ultimate indictment of legal systems that failed those who needed protection most desperately, while enabling continued abuse by those who understood how to exploit procedural safeguards for criminal purposes. Jason's immediate response to Gloria's death was not grief, but rage, a white-hot fury that demanded action rather than mourning, confrontation rather than acceptance, justice rather than philosophical reflection about the nature of evil and the limitations of human institutions. The anger that consumed him was focused and purposeful, rather than chaotic or destructive, channeled towards specific objectives that required careful planning and tactical precision rather than emotional expression. The confrontation at Felipe's apartment was conducted with the same methodical approach that characterized all of Batman's operations, yet Jason's psychological state transformed routine investigation into something approaching an execution. His approach to the building, his infiltration of Felipe's security measures, his positioning for optimal tactical advantage, all reflected professional competence combined with lethal intent that exceeded anything Batman had taught him or anticipated. Felipe's reaction to discovering Robin in his apartment revealed both his complete lack of remorse for his crimes and his absolute confidence that his diplomatic immunity provided protection from any meaningful consequences for his actions. His casual dismissal of Gloria's death, his obvious anticipation of future opportunities for predation, his contemptuous attitude toward those who lacked the social status to challenge him effectively, all served to confirm Jason's assessment of his irredeemable nature and the necessity of permanent solutions to threats that transcended legal remedies. The moment of decision that followed Felipe's attempt to flee represented the culmination of months of philosophical evolution and moral crisis that had transformed Jason from eager apprentice into something approaching an avenging anger. The choice between allowing a predator to escape or ensuring permanent protection for his potential victims was made not through rational deliberation, but through instinctive response to moral clarity that transcended abstract principles and constitutional niceties. The fall from the balcony that ended Felipe's life was witnessed only by Jason and the perpetrator himself, creating ambiguity about whether the death resulted from accident, suicide, or homicide that would persist long after the immediate consequences had been resolved. Jason's claim that Felipe had slipped while attempting to escape provided a plausible explanation that satisfied official investigators while preserving operational security and avoiding complex legal proceedings that might have exposed Batman's methods to unwanted scrutiny. Batman's arrival at the scene moments after Felipe's death created an immediate crisis of trust and authority that neither he nor Jason was prepared to address directly or resolve definitively. The unspoken question that hung between them challenged fundamental assumptions about their partnership, their shared commitment to specific methods, and their mutual understanding of acceptable boundaries for vigilante action in circumstances that exceeded conventional moral categories. The ambiguity surrounding Felipe's death served both practical and psychological purposes for Jason, providing plausible deniability, while also allowing him to experience the satisfaction of knowing that a predator had been permanently stopped, regardless of the specific mechanism that achieved this result. The possibility that his intervention had saved future victims from suffering similar to Gloria's provided moral justification that transcended concerns about procedural correctness or philosophical consistency. The retaliation that followed Felipe's death demonstrated both the international implications of diplomatic crimes and the personal risks that vigilante justice created for those who chose to operate outside official channels. Jose Garzonis's decision to hold Commissioner Gordon hostage represented an escalation of violence that threatened to expose Batman's operations, while also creating tactical challenges that required careful coordination between official law enforcement, and vigilante intervention. The resolution of the hostage crisis through Batman's direct action resulted in Jose's accidental death, providing Jason with evidence that even his mentor was capable of killing when circumstances demanded decisive action to protect innocent lives. The parallel between Felipe's fall and Jose's death under the collapsed structure suggested that moral absolutes might be more flexible than Batman's public statements indicated, creating possibilities for future cooperation based on shared understanding rather than philosophical disagreement. The aftermath of the Garzona's case marked a permanent change in the dynamic between Batman and Robin, as unspoken tensions about methods and boundaries replaced the easy cooperation that had characterized their early partnership. Neither participant explicitly acknowledged what had occurred or discussed its implications for their future relationship, yet both understood that something fundamental had shifted in ways that could not be reversed through explanation or apology. Jason's subsequent behavior reflected growing confidence in his own moral judgment, combined with increasing willingness to push boundaries and test limits in ways that challenged Batman's authority while stopping short of open defiance or complete independence. His approach to investigations became more aggressive, his treatment of suspects more harsh, his patience with legal procedures more limited, all suggesting psychological evolution that worried Alfred and frustrated Batman, while also demonstrating effectiveness that was difficult to criticize or discourage. The pattern of escalation that characterized Jason's development during this period reflected both his natural growth as a crime fighter and his increasing frustration with constraints that seemed to enable continued suffering while prioritizing procedural correctness over substantive results. Each successful mission that failed to provide permanent solutions to recurring threats served as evidence that conventional methods were inadequately equipped to address the scale and persistence of evil that characterized Gotham's criminal underworld. The philosophical debates that occurred during long nights in the Batcave revealed fundamental differences in worldview that could not be resolved through rational discourse or mutual compromise. Yet both Batman and Jason continued to hope that time and experience would eventually produce the understanding and agreement that seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing month. The failure of communication reflected not intellectual limitations but emotional investment in incompatible visions of justice that demanded different responses to identical situations. The breaking point that would eventually lead to Jason's removal from active duty as Robin was approaching with mathematical inevitability, yet neither participant fully understood the forces that were driving them toward confrontation or possessed the emotional tools necessary to address their growing estrangement before it became irreparable. The tragic events that would soon unfold in Ethiopia were made possible not by single catastrophic errors, but by the gradual accumulation of unresolved tensions and unaddressed disagreements that had been building throughout their partnership, despite their mutual affection and shared commitment to protecting innocent life. The discovery that would forever alter the trajectory of Jason Todd's brief but turbulent life began not with dramatic revelation, but with the mundane sorting of personal effects, those forgotten remnants of family history that accumulate in cardboard boxes and forgotten drawers, waiting decades for curious hands to disturb their dust-covered slumber. The old woman who approached Jason in Crime Alley carried with her more than simple belongings. She bore the weight of secrets that had shaped his existence without his knowledge, truths that would prove both liberating and devastating in ways that neither she nor he could have anticipated or prepared for during their brief encounter. The birth certificate that emerged from among Catherine Todd's possessions represented more than bureaucratic documentation. It was a key that unlocked questions Jason had never known to ask, a doorway into mysteries that challenged everything he had believed about his origins and identity. The careful examination of the document revealed discrepancies that could not be explained through simple clerical error or administrative confusion, inconsistencies that demanded investigation, despite the emotional risks inherent in discovering that one's understanding of family history had been fundamentally flawed. Catherine Todd, the woman he had mourned as his mother, and whose memory he had cherished despite her struggles with addiction, was revealed to have been his stepmother, a relationship that explained both her genuine affection for him and the subtle distances that had sometimes characterized their interactions. The realization that his biological mother remained alive somewhere in the world created possibilities for connection and understanding that he had never dared to imagine, yet also raised questions about abandonment and rejection that threatened to reopen wounds he had thought permanently healed. The search for his true mother became an obsession that consumed Jason's thoughts and dominated his activities during what would prove to be the final weeks of his life as Robin. The three names that emerged from his investigation represented three different possibilities for maternal connection, three potential explanations for the circumstances that had led to his birth and early abandonment, three women whose stories might provide the missing pieces of his personal puzzle, or might instead create new mysteries and disappointments. Charmin Rosen had immigrated to Israel to work with the intelligence services, her background suggesting competence and dedication that might have made her an admirable parent under different circumstances. Yet her departure from the United States coincided suspiciously with the time frame of Jason's birth, raising questions about whether her relocation had been motivated by career opportunities or by desire to escape complications created by an unplanned pregnancy and unwanted child. Lady Shiva represented the most dangerous of the potential candidates, her reputation as an assassin and mercenary, creating scenarios in which Jason's birth might have been the result of violence or coercion rather than consensual relationship. The possibility that his biological mother was one of the world's most dangerous killers carried implications that extended beyond personal identity to encompass questions about inherited traits and predispositions that might influence his own development and choices. Dr. Sheila Haywood's work with humanitarian relief efforts in Ethiopia provided the most appealing possibility for maternal reunion, as her dedication to alleviating suffering suggested the kind of compassionate nature that Jason hoped to discover in his biological parent. Her medical background and international service created a portrait of someone who had dedicated her life to helping others, characteristics that might explain both her initial abandonment of her child and her potential willingness to rebuild their relationship if circumstances permitted. The decision to pursue his investigation independently, without consulting Batman or seeking official support, reflected Jason's growing need for autonomy and his desire to control the emotional risks inherent in such a deeply personal quest. The secrecy that surrounded his departure from Gotham was motivated not by shame or guilt, but by recognition that the search for his mother was something that required private resolution, regardless of its impact on his responsibilities as Robin or his relationship with Bruce Wayne. The use of Bruce's credit cards to finance his international travel represented both practical necessity and symbolic assertion of his right to pursue personal fulfillment, even when it conflicted with operational security and bout of established protocols. Jason understood that his actions would eventually be discovered and that consequences would follow, yet the importance of resolving questions about his identity outweighed concerns about punishment or disapproval from authority figures who had never faced similar mysteries about their own origins. The journey to the Middle East marked Jason's first significant travel outside the United States, and his first exposure to cultures and environments radically different from the urban landscape that had shaped his entire previous experience. The sensory overload of new languages, unfamiliar customs, and different social expectations created both excitement and anxiety as he navigated complex logistical challenges while maintaining focus on his primary objective of locating his biological mother. Batman's pursuit of the Joker to the same region represented one of those coincidences that seemed to suggest cosmic design rather than random chance, though neither participant initially recognized the fatal implications of their convergent paths. The Joker's latest scheme involved international arms dealing and nuclear terrorism, threats that demanded immediate attention and intervention, regardless of their potential interference with Jason's personal mission or their own complicated emotional dynamics. The reunion between Batman and Robin in Israeli airspace created an opportunity for both cooperation and confrontation, as their shared presence in the region allowed for tactical coordination, while also forcing acknowledgement of Jason's unauthorized departure and independent agenda. The compromise that emerged from their negotiations reflected mutual recognition that both missions possessed legitimate importance and that their success might depend upon collaborative effort rather than separate operations. The elimination of Charmin Rosen and Lady Shiva as potential mothers was accomplished through direct questioning that revealed neither woman had given birth during the relevant time frame or had any knowledge of Jason's existence. Their denials were convincing enough to redirect attention toward the remaining candidate, while also providing relief that his biological mother was neither a spy nor an assassin whose professional activities might have created additional complications for his already complex life as Robin. Dr. Sheila Haywood's humanitarian work in Ethiopia provided both cover for the Joker's criminal activities and context for the deadly convergence of personal quest and professional obligation that would define the final chapters of Jason Todd's existence. Her legitimate medical mission created plausible reasons for international travel and foreign contacts, while also providing opportunities for the kind of corruption and exploitation that the Joker specialized in identifying and manipulating for his own purposes. The refugee camp that served as Dr. Haywood's base of operations represented human suffering on a scale that exceeded even Jason's extensive experience with urban poverty and criminal victimization. The systematic starvation, disease, and violence that characterized daily life for the displaced populations provided stark evidence of humanity's capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and remarkable resilience in circumstances that challenged every assumption about civilization and progress. Jason's first meeting with his biological mother created emotions that he struggled to process and express adequately, as the joy of finally discovering her identity competed with anger about her abandonment and uncertainty about her motivations for both past and present actions. Sheila's apparent pleasure at their reunion seemed genuine, yet her nervousness and evasiveness when discussing their past relationship suggested complexities that she was reluctant to address directly or completely. The medical work that brought Sheila to Ethiopia was both legitimate and necessary, providing essential healthcare services to populations that would otherwise have had no access to professional treatment or basic medications. Her skills and dedication were evident in her interactions with patients and her tireless efforts to address needs that far exceeded available resources, creating a portrait of someone who had dedicated her career to humanitarian service, despite the personal costs and professional limitations. The gradual revelation of the Joker's presence in the region came through intelligence gathered during routine investigation rather than dramatic confrontation. Yet the implications of his involvement transformed what should have been a simple reunion into a complex tactical situation that demanded careful planning and coordination. His interest in the refugee camp was motivated not by humanitarian concerns, but by opportunities for profit through the theft and resale of medical supplies intended for the desperate populations under Dr. Haywood's care. The blackmail scheme that gave the Joker leverage over Dr. Haywood revealed the corruption that had preceded his arrival and created the vulnerabilities that made his current operation possible. Her embezzlement of medical supplies and relief funds had begun as small-scale theft, motivated by personal financial pressures, but had gradually escalated into systematic fraud that threatened not only her career but also the welfare of the patients who depended upon her services for survival. The moral complexity of Sheila's situation created empathy rather than condemnation from Jason, who understood better than most how desperation could lead fundamentally decent people to make choices that conflicted with their values and principles. Her theft of medical supplies was inexcusable yet comprehensible, a product of circumstances that offered no good alternatives rather than evidence of inherent criminality or moral failure. The Joker's exploitation of her vulnerability represented his characteristic ability to identify and manipulate human weaknesses for maximum psychological impact and practical advantage. His threats were calibrated to ensure compliance, while also creating the kind of moral anguish that provided him with entertainment beyond simple financial gain, transforming straightforward extortion into an exercise in psychological torture that satisfied his sadistic impulses. Jason's decision to intervene independently, despite Batman's explicit instructions to wait for backup, reflected both his natural protective instincts and his growing confidence in his abilities as a crime fighter. The knowledge that his mother was in immediate danger from one of Gotham's most dangerous criminals created emotional urgency that overrode tactical considerations and operational protocols, transforming a rescue mission into a personal crusade that brooked no delay or compromise. The warehouse where the Joker had established his operations served as both storage facility for stolen medical supplies and torture chamber for those who had crossed or disappointed him. The interior layout had been modified to maximize psychological impact on victims, while also providing defensive advantages for the criminal and his associates, creating an environment designed to inspire fear and hopelessness in anyone unfortunate enough to be brought there. Jason's approach to the building demonstrated the stealth and tactical skills that had been developed through months of training and practical experience. Yet his emotional investment in the outcome created subtle alterations in his normal operational patterns that would prove fatally significant. The combination of personal stakes and professional competence created overconfidence that led to strategic errors and tactical vulnerabilities that a more detached approach might have avoided. The interior of the warehouse revealed both the scope of the Joker's theft operation and the immediate danger facing Dr. Hayward, who had been restrained and threatened in ways designed to ensure cooperation, while also providing the Joker with opportunities for sadistic entertainment. Her obvious terror and desperation created additional emotional pressure on Jason, while also providing the Joker with psychological leverage that he would use to maximum advantage. The initial confrontation between Robin and the Joker followed patterns established during their previous encounters, with the young hero's superior agility and training offsetting the criminal's experience and ruthless willingness to escalate violence beyond conventional boundaries. Yet the presence of Jason's mother as a hostage fundamentally altered the tactical dynamics in ways that favored the Joker's psychological warfare over Robin's physical advantages. The betrayal that followed represented the culmination of Dr. Hayward's moral compromise and the tragic intersection of maternal love with criminal coercion. Her decision to cooperate with the Joker, rather than support her son's rescue attempt, was motivated not by malice or indifference, but by fear of consequences that seemed worse than the temporary betrayal of someone who possessed the strength and skills to potentially survive the encounter. The revelation that she had been working with the Joker prior to Jason's arrival transformed the reunion from joyous discovery into devastating betrayal, yet the complexity of her motivations prevented simple moral judgments about her choices or character. Her involvement in the theft operation had been coerced rather than voluntary, yet her decision to sacrifice her son's safety for her own protection represented a moral failure that could not be excused by circumstances, however dire they might have been. Jason's response to his mother's betrayal was not anger but heartbreak, as the discovery that she valued her own survival more than his welfare destroyed the fantasy of maternal love that had sustained him throughout his search and investigation. The realization that she had chosen the Joker's protection over his own life created psychological wounds that were more devastating than any physical damage the criminal might inflict through direct violence. The beating that followed was conducted with the same methodical brutality that had characterized the Joker's previous attacks on those who had interfered with his plans or disappointed his expectations. The crowbar that served as his primary weapon was selected not for practical considerations, but for its symbolic significance, representing the kind of mundane tool that could be transformed into an instrument of torture through the application of sufficient malice and creativity. The physical damage inflicted during the assault was severe enough to threaten Jason's life while stopping short of immediate fatality, creating the kind of prolonged suffering that provided the Joker with maximum entertainment value while also serving his practical purposes. Each blow was calculated to cause specific types of injury that would contribute to cumulative trauma without ending the experience prematurely or reducing opportunities for psychological manipulation. The psychological dimension of the torture was as carefully orchestrated as the physical violence, with the Joker providing commentary and analysis designed to maximize emotional impact while also demonstrating his understanding of human nature and his contempt for conventional morality. His observations about betrayal, abandonment, and the fundamental inadequacy of heroic idealism were crafted to destroy hope rather than simply cause pain. Dr. Hayward's presence during the assault served multiple purposes for the Joker, providing him with additional opportunities for psychological manipulation, while also ensuring that Jason's final experiences would include the knowledge that his mother was witnessing his destruction without intervening on his behalf. Her obvious distress at the violence was genuine yet insufficient to motivate the kind of protective action that might have altered the outcome. The warehouse explosion that was intended to eliminate all evidence of the Joker's activities and provide him with a dramatic conclusion to his latest scheme also offered Jason a final opportunity to demonstrate the heroic qualities that had defined his career as Robin despite his recent struggles with moral ambiguity and tactical disagreements. His last conscious acts were devoted to attempting to save his mother despite her betrayal, illustrating the fundamental decency that had survived corruption and disillusionment. The timer that counted down the final minutes of Jason's life created artificial urgency that was both tactically unnecessary and psychologically devastating, providing the Joker with additional opportunities for sadistic satisfaction, while also ensuring that any potential rescue would be complicated by temporal constraints that favored dramatic rather than practical considerations. The 10-minute delay was calculated to allow escape while preventing effective intervention by outside forces. Jason's final moments were characterized not by rage or despair, but by determination to save someone who had betrayed him, demonstrating that his capacity for heroism transcended personal grievances and emotional wounds. His efforts to break through the warehouse restraints and reach his mother were motivated by the same protective instincts that had made him effective as Robin, proving that his moral development had been fundamentally sound despite his recent struggles with Batman's rigid ethical code. The explosion that claimed both Jason and Sheila represented the ultimate failure of heroic intervention, and the triumph of chaos over order, evil over good, destruction over protection. The blast was visible from miles away, serving as a beacon that drew Batman's attention, while also ensuring that no trace of the victims would remain for identification or proper burial rites. Batman's arrival at the scene minutes after the explosion provided him with evidence of what had occurred while denying him the opportunity for meaningful intervention or rescue. The discovery of Jason's broken body among the wreckage created trauma that would define Bruce Wayne's psychological state for years to come, transforming grief into guilt and loss into obsession with his own failures as mentor and protector. The recovery of Jason's remains required careful excavation through debris that had been scattered across hundreds of yards, creating a crime scene that revealed both the scope of the destruction and the impossibility of determining exactly what had occurred during the final moments before the explosion. The physical evidence suggested that Jason had died attempting to reach his mother, though the specific circumstances remained ambiguous. The body that was eventually recovered showed signs of massive trauma that exceeded what the explosion alone could have caused, providing evidence of the brutal assault that had preceded the blast, while also creating questions about whether Jason had been conscious during his final moments or had already succumbed to his injuries before the building collapsed. The medical examiner's report would indicate that death had resulted from a combination of blunt force trauma and explosive force, though the exact sequence remained unclear. The funeral arrangements that followed reflected both Jason's status as a member of the Wayne family and the secrecy that surrounded his identity as Robin, creating logistical challenges that required careful coordination between public ceremonies and private grief. The limited attendance at the service reflected his isolation from normal social connections, while also protecting operational security for Batman's continuing mission. Bruce Wayne's eulogy for Jason focused on his courage, determination, and commitment to protecting others, rather than his recent struggles with moral ambiguity and tactical disagreements, creating a public narrative that honored his memory while avoiding details that might have compromised ongoing investigations or revealed sensitive information about Batman's operations. The private grief that Bruce experienced was far more complex and painful than anything that could be expressed in formal remarks. The grave marker that was erected in Jason's memory bore only his name and dates of birth and death, providing no indication of his role as Robin or his significance in Batman's crusade against crime. The simple stone reflected both the humble circumstances of his origins and the secrecy that had surrounded his transformation into a hero, creating a monument that was both adequate and insufficient as recognition for his sacrifices. Alfred's response to Jason's death combined genuine grief with practical concern for Bruce's psychological welfare, as the butler recognized that the loss would create trauma that might fundamentally alter Batman's approach to crime fighting and his willingness to form emotional connections with others. The careful monitoring that followed was motivated by understanding that grief could be as dangerous as any physical injury if left untreated or allowed to fester. The Joker's survival of the explosion and subsequent escape created additional complications for the investigation, while also ensuring that justice for Jason's murder would remain elusive despite the overwhelming evidence of the criminal's guilt. His diplomatic immunity as Iran's ambassador to the United Nations provided legal protection that prevented prosecution regardless of the evidence or the severity of his crimes, creating frustration that compounded the grief of loss. The realization that the Joker would face no legal consequences for Jason's murder tested Batman's commitment to his moral code in ways that previous cases had never approached, creating temptations toward lethal violence that required constant vigilance and support from allies who understood the psychological pressures he was experiencing. The decision to maintain his principles despite the personal cost represented both strength and weakness, moral victory and tactical failure. The final confrontation between Batman and the Joker at the United Nations provided an opportunity for justice that was ultimately frustrated by circumstances beyond either participant's control, as the criminal's death resulted from accidental rather than deliberate violence. The helicopter crash that ended the encounter left questions about intention and outcome that would torment Bruce Wayne for years, while also denying him the satisfaction of deliberate vengeance or conscious choice about lethal force. The unresolved nature of Jason's death and the Joker's survival created psychological wounds that would influence Batman's behavior and decision-making for decades to come, transforming him from someone who had overcome personal tragedy into someone haunted by professional failure and lost opportunities for redemption. The empty costume that remained in the Batcave served as a constant reminder of what had been lost and what might have been preserved through different choices and better protection. The legacy of Jason Todd's death extended beyond personal grief to encompass questions about the wisdom of involving children in dangerous activities, the adequacy of training and preparation for extreme situations, and the moral implications of vigilante justice in a world where legal institutions consistently failed to protect the innocent or punish the guilty. His sacrifice had saved no one, prevented nothing, accomplished nothing, except to demonstrate the ultimate inadequacy of heroic idealism when confronted with pure malevolence and systematic evil. The silence that followed Jason Todd's death was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the hollow emptiness that accompanies profound loss, a void that seemed to expand with each passing day rather than diminish through the natural processes of grief and healing. In the depths of the Batcave, where the echoes of their conversations still lingered in shadowed corners, and their shared victories had once provided validation for dangerous choices, Bruce Wayne found himself confronting the ultimate failure of his mission and the devastating consequences of his decision to involve a child in warfare against forces that recognized no boundaries of age or innocence. The costume that remained in its display case served as more than simple memorial. It became a constant reminder of potential unrealized, of a young life cut short before it could fulfill its promise or find its proper place in the complex ecosystem of heroism and justice that defined Gotham's ongoing struggle against chaos. The red and green colors that had once symbolized hope and renewal now carried only associations with tragedy and loss, transforming symbols of partnership into monuments of failure that challenged every assumption Bruce had maintained about his ability to protect those who chose to stand beside him. Alfred's quiet presence during those first weeks provided the only barrier between Bruce and the complete psychological collapse that threatened to consume him as thoroughly as grief had consumed other parents who had lost children to violence and circumstance beyond their control. The butler's understanding of loss, gained through decades of service to a family that had been shattered by random cruelty and rebuilt through dedication to impossible ideals, enabled him to provide support without judgment, comfort without false reassurance, presence without demands for recovery or resolution. The investigation into Jason's death continued long after official agencies had closed their files and moved on to more current cases. Yet every lead ended in frustration, and every piece of evidence only confirmed what Bruce already knew, that his greatest enemy had murdered his adopted son and would face no consequences through legal channels that might have provided some measure of justice or closure. The diplomatic immunity that protected the Joker was absolute and unassailable, creating a barrier between crime and punishment that no amount of detective work or political pressure could breach. The physical changes that grief imposed upon Bruce Wayne were subtle but significant, visible primarily in the increased intensity with which he pursued his nocturnal activities, and the decreased attention he paid to maintaining the social obligations and personal relationships that had once provided balance and perspective to his dual existence. The businessman who had once moved easily through Gotham's elite social circles became increasingly reclusive, while the masked vigilante who prowled the city's streets grew more violent and unpredictable in his confrontations with criminal elements. The first signs of his psychological deterioration became apparent to those who knew him best through small changes in routine and behavior that accumulated into patterns of concern. His sleeping schedule, never regular under the best of circumstances, became increasingly erratic as he sought to exhaust himself sufficiently to avoid the dreams that brought memories of Jason's laughter and optimism back to haunt his rest. His eating habits deteriorated as he lost interest in maintaining physical health that seemed irrelevant when measured against the weight of his failure and the emptiness of his mission. The criminals who encountered Batman during this period experienced a version of Gotham's protector that was more brutal and unforgiving than any they had previously faced. As Bruce channeled his grief and rage into violence that stopped just short of the lethal force he had always forbidden himself to employ, the psychological impact of these encounters created ripples of fear and uncertainty throughout Gotham's underworld, as veteran criminals who thought they understood the rules of engagement found themselves facing someone whose moral constraints seemed to have dissolved along with his capacity for mercy and restraint. The isolation that grief imposed upon Bruce was both self-inflicted and externally reinforced, as his increasing inability to maintain normal social interactions combined with others' discomfort around someone whose loss was visible in every gesture and expression. The friends and associates who might have provided support found themselves pushed away by his unwillingness to accept comfort or discuss his experiences, while his growing obsession with Jason's death made conversation difficult and relationships strained. The memorial service that was held for Jason at Wayne Manor was attended by a small group of individuals who had known him personally rather than professionally, creating a gathering that honored his memory while carefully avoiding any reference to his activities as Robin or his connection to Batman's mission. The eulogies delivered by those who had worked with him at various charitable organizations and community programs painted a picture of someone who had overcome disadvantage through determination and kindness, though they could not capture the full complexity of his character or the significance of his transformation. Commissioner Gordon's awareness of the connection between Jason's death and Batman's changed behavior was never explicitly acknowledged. Yet his increased concern for Gotham's vigilante and his more frequent attempts to initiate communication suggested understanding that went beyond simple professional obligation. The unspoken support he offered through tactical cooperation and strategic patience reflected his recognition that the city needed Batman, even in his diminished state, while also acknowledging that intervention might be necessary if the deterioration continued. The empty chair at the dining table in Wayne Manor became a focal point for Alfred's own grief and worry, as meals that had once provided opportunities for conversation and connection became solitary affairs that emphasized absence rather than presence. The butler's attempts to maintain normal routines and traditions in the face of profound change reflected both his dedication to the Wayne family and his understanding that structure and continuity might eventually provide pathways back toward healing and renewal. The appearance of Tim Drake in Bruce's life represented both opportunity and threat, as the boy's obvious intelligence and detective skills offered possibilities for partnership, while also raising questions about whether Bruce possessed the psychological stability and moral authority to accept responsibility for another young person's welfare and development. Tim's initial approach was motivated not by desire to become Robin, but by recognition that Batman needed a partner to maintain his effectiveness and prevent his complete descent into the kind of isolation that might destroy both him and his mission. The resistance that Bruce initially displayed toward Tim's involvement reflected both practical concerns about safety and deeper fears about his capacity to protect someone who chose to stand beside him in his war against Gotham's criminal elements. The knowledge that he had failed Jason in the most fundamental way possible made the prospect of accepting responsibility for another young life seem like both moral obligation and inexcusable risk, creating internal conflicts that could not be resolved through rational analysis or emotional appeal. Tim's persistence in pursuing partnership with Batman demonstrated both courage and understanding that exceeded his chronological age, as he recognized that Bruce's refusal to accept help was motivated by grief rather than judgment about his capabilities or potential. The careful patience with which he approached the relationship, his willingness to prove himself gradually rather than demand immediate acceptance, and his obvious respect for Jason's memory all contributed to his eventual success in earning Bruce's trust and cooperation. The months of evaluation and testing that preceded Tim's official acceptance as the third Robin reflected Bruce's determination to avoid repeating the mistakes that had contributed to Jason's death, yet also revealed the impossibility of eliminating risk entirely when confronting enemies who recognized no moral boundaries or legal constraints. The training regimen was more comprehensive and demanding than what Jason had received, incorporating lessons learned from tragedy, while acknowledging that preparation could never guarantee safety or success. The psychological counseling that Alfred quietly arranged for Bruce during this period was conducted by professionals who specialized in trauma and loss. Though the unique circumstances of his situation made conventional therapeutic approaches inadequate for addressing the complexities of vigilante guilt and the moral implications of involving children in dangerous activities, the sessions provided some relief from the isolation that grief had imposed, while also forcing him to confront questions about motivation and responsibility that he had previously avoided through action and dedication to external goals. The return to active partnership with the introduction of Tim as Robin marked the beginning of Bruce's gradual recovery from the worst effects of his grief. Though the healing process would require years and would never completely eliminate the psychological scars that Jason's death had created, the new dynamic was different from what he had experienced with either Dick or Jason, influenced by hard-won wisdom about the costs of heroism and the importance of emotional support and psychological preparation for those who chose to join his mission. The case files that Bruce maintained on Jason's death continued to grow throughout this period, as new information and alternative theories were investigated with obsessive thoroughness despite the obvious futility of pursuing justice through conventional channels. The documentation served multiple purposes: preserving evidence that might eventually prove useful, maintaining connection with someone who could no longer be protected, and providing focus for grief that might otherwise have consumed all capacity for constructive action. The visits that Bruce made to Jason's grave became regular rituals that provided structure and meaning to his recovery process, though the conversations he conducted with the headstone remained private experiences that even Alfred was careful not to intrude upon or inquire about directly. These moments of solitude and reflection served as opportunities for processing guilt and grief, while also reaffirming commitment to principles and values that Jason's death had tested but not destroyed. The changes in Batman's operational methods that emerged during this period reflected both lessons learned from tragedy and ongoing psychological adaptation to loss that could never be completely overcome or forgotten. The increased emphasis on intelligence gathering and tactical preparation, the more extensive use of non-lethal restraints and protective equipment, and the greater coordination with law enforcement agencies all demonstrated evolution in response to experience, while maintaining fundamental commitments to justice and protection of innocent life. The criminal elements who had hoped that Jason's death might weaken Batman's effectiveness discovered instead that grief had transformed, rather than diminished, their primary nemesis, creating someone whose dedication to his mission was intensified rather than compromised by personal loss. The psychological impact of this realization served to maintain the deterrent effect that Batman's presence had always created, while also demonstrating that heroism could survive tragedy even when it could not prevent or reverse it. The support network that gradually developed around Bruce during his recovery included individuals who had experienced similar losses and understood the specific challenges of continuing meaningful work while processing profound grief. Their informal assistance and understanding provided alternatives to professional therapy, while also creating connections that helped combat the isolation that had threatened to make his psychological wounds permanent rather than temporary. The anniversary of Jason's death became an annual observance that honored his memory while also serving as a milestone for measuring progress in healing and recovery. The private ceremonies that marked these occasions evolved over time from expressions of pure grief toward more complex acknowledgments of loss, gratitude, and renewed commitment to values and principles that his sacrifice had illuminated and strengthened rather than undermined. The questions that continued to haunt Bruce about his decision-making and responsibility in the events leading to Jason's death never received definitive answers. Yet, the ongoing process of examination and reflection served constructive purposes in refining judgment and improving preparation for future challenges. The wisdom gained through tragedy was purchased at a price that no rational person would willingly pay, yet once acquired it, created obligations to use that knowledge in service of preventing similar losses whenever possible. The legacy of Jason Todd began to take shape during this period not through dramatic monuments or public recognition, but through subtle changes in approach and philosophy that influenced every aspect of Batman's continuing mission. His memory became integrated into operational planning, training protocols, and decision-making processes in ways that honored his contribution, while acknowledging the costs of heroism and the responsibilities of leadership in dangerous undertakings. The moment when Hush manipulated Clayface to impersonate Jason represented both cruel exploitation of Bruce's grief and inadvertent validation of the psychological importance that the dead Robin continued to hold in Batman's consciousness. The brief encounter with what appeared to be his returned son created emotional turbulence that nearly compromised tactical effectiveness, while also demonstrating that healing from loss was an ongoing process rather than a destination that could be reached and permanently maintained. The revelation that the impersonation was fraudulent provided relief mixed with renewed grief, as the false hope was recognized and discarded, while the underlying reality of loss reasserted itself with fresh intensity. The manipulation served Hush's immediate tactical purposes, while also providing Bruce with additional insight into his own psychological vulnerabilities and the ways that enemies might exploit personal history for strategic advantage. The discussions between Bruce and Alfred about removing Jason's costume from its memorial display reflected ongoing debates about the proper relationship between memory and present reality, between honoring the dead and serving the living. The decision to maintain the shrine in its original form represented conscious choice to accept the pain of remembrance as preferable to the emptiness of forgetfulness, acknowledging that some forms of healing required continued engagement with, rather than avoidance of difficult emotions. The gradual integration of Jason's story into the broader narrative of Batman's mission served educational purposes for future partners, while also ensuring that his sacrifice would not be forgotten or dismissed as simply an unfortunate accident in an otherwise successful career. The lessons learned from his death became part of the institutional knowledge that defined Batman's operations, influencing training, preparation, and decision-making in ways that might prevent similar tragedies while honoring his memory through practical application of hard-won wisdom. The influence of Jason's memory on Bruce's relationship with Tim Drake was both protective and limiting, as determination to avoid repeating past mistakes sometimes created excessive caution that constrained opportunities for growth and development. The careful balance between safety and effectiveness required constant adjustment as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. Yet the underlying commitment to preserving life while pursuing justice remained constant even when specific methods evolved in response to experience. The criminal underworld's awareness of Batman's personal loss created both opportunities and vulnerabilities, as some enemies sought to exploit perceived weakness, while others recognized that grief had intensified rather than diminished his dedication to their destruction. The psychological warfare that characterized some confrontations during this period reflected understanding that emotional attacks might prove more effective than physical ones, though the results generally demonstrated that shared experience of loss created strength rather than vulnerability in those who chose to continue fighting despite the costs. The recovery process that began during this period would continue for years, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs that reflected the non-linear nature of healing from profound trauma. The integration of Tim Drake into Batman's operations marked the beginning of a new chapter that honored Jason's memory while acknowledging that life and mission must continue despite loss, that heroism required moving forward, even when the past contained failures that could never be corrected or fully forgiven. The silence that had initially followed Jason's death gradually gave way to remembrance that celebrated his contributions while acknowledging his struggles, that recognized his heroism while accepting the reality of his loss. The transformation of grief into wisdom, of failure into dedication, of ending into new beginning, represented the kind of resurrection that was possible even when death itself could not be reversed or denied. In choosing to continue his mission while carrying the weight of Jason's memory, Bruce Wayne demonstrated that heroism could survive tragedy, that love could persist beyond loss, and that the fight for justice could continue even when victory came at costs that seemed too high to bear. The resurrection of Jason Todd began not with the dramatic flourish of divine intervention or scientific miracle, but with the subtle manipulation of reality's fundamental structure by forces so vast and incomprehensible that their casual alteration of existence itself passed unnoticed by all but those few individuals who possessed the cosmic awareness necessary to perceive changes in the fabric of space and time. Superboy Prime's rage-fueled assault upon the dimensional barriers that separated parallel universes created ripples of consequence that extended far beyond his immediate destructive intentions, reshaping history and possibility in ways that would not become apparent until their effects manifested in the lives of individuals who had never known that their fates had been subject to revision. The moment of Jason's return to life occurred simultaneously across multiple temporal coordinates, as reality retroactively adjusted itself to accommodate contradictions and impossibilities that should have rendered existence itself unstable and chaotic. The cosmic forces that governed such fundamental alterations operated according to principles that transcended human understanding of cause and effect, creating scenarios where death could be undone without negating the experiences and consequences that had resulted from it, where resurrection could occur without eliminating the grief and growth that loss had generated in those left behind. The coffin that had served as Jason's final resting place became the womb of his rebirth, though the transition from death to life was neither peaceful nor pleasant, but rather a traumatic awakening that combined physical agony with psychological horror in ways that challenged every assumption about the nature of mortality and the permanence of death. his consciousness returned not gradually but with shocking suddenness, flooding back into a body that had been broken by violence and transformed by decay, creating sensory experiences that exceeded the capacity of human language to describe or human imagination to fully comprehend. The panic that accompanied his awakening was absolute and overwhelming, as his mind struggled to process the impossibility of his situation, while his body responded with instinctive terror to the confined darkness and suffocating atmosphere that surrounded him. The rational understanding that he was buried alive competed with fragmented memories of his death and confused awareness that something fundamental had changed in ways that extended beyond simple resurrection to encompass alterations in the very nature of his existence and relationship to the world around him. The physical act of escape from his grave required superhuman effort, fueled by desperation and confusion, as his enhanced strength and durability enabled him to accomplish what should have been impossible for someone in his weakened condition. The clawing through earth and coffin wood that brought him back to the surface was conducted with mechanical persistence rather than conscious planning, driven by survival instincts that operated independently of rational thought or emotional processing of his circumstances. The emergence from the earth that had been intended as his final resting place marked the beginning of a journey that would test every aspect of his identity and challenge fundamental assumptions about heroism, justice, and the relationship between past and present that had defined his previous existence. The world that greeted him was both familiar and alien, changed in ways that reflected the passage of time, while also remaining recognizably the same environment that had shaped his development and ultimately witnessed his destruction. The injuries that had killed him remained present in his resurrected form, creating constant reminders of his death, while also serving as evidence that his return to life was not simply restoration to his previous state, but rather transformation into something unprecedented and potentially dangerous. The cracked ribs that made breathing difficult, the skull fractures that created persistent headaches and occasional disorientation, the internal damage that caused unpredictable pain, all testified to the violence that had ended his first life, while also demonstrating the incomplete nature of whatever force had returned him to existence. The 12.5-mile journey from cemetery to civilization was undertaken in a state of delirium and confusion that prevented clear memory formation, while also providing time for his transformed physiology to begin adapting to glyphis, consciousness, and voluntary movement. The walk was both pilgrimage and ordeal, a test of endurance that prepared him psychologically for the challenges that would follow, while also serving as transition between his previous existence as Jason Todd and whatever he was destined to become in his resurrected state. The couple who discovered him wandering along a rural highway saw only a young man in obvious distress, injured and disoriented, but clearly in need of immediate medical attention rather than interrogation about circumstances that seemed too bizarre to be credible. Their decision to transport him to the nearest hospital was motivated by basic human compassion rather than curiosity about his identity or the source of his injuries, creating the first positive human interaction of his new existence. The hospital admission that followed his rescue created the administrative identity of John Doe, a designation that reflected both his inability to provide accurate information about himself and the medical staff's assumption that his condition was the result of conventional trauma rather than supernatural resurrection. The coma that claimed him shortly after arrival was interpreted as a natural consequence of his injuries, rather than evidence of the profound neurological adjustments that his consciousness was undergoing as it adapted to existence in a transformed body. The brain damage that resulted from his death and resurrection was not merely physical but also spiritual and psychological, affecting his capacity for memory formation, emotional regulation, and rational decision-making in ways that would influence every aspect of his future development. The medical professionals who monitored his condition were equipped to address conventional neurological trauma, but possessed no framework for understanding or treating the unique complications that arose from consciousness returning to a body that had experienced cellular death and decay. The period of unconsciousness that preceded his awakening provided time for his enhanced physiology to repair some of the damage, while also allowing his mind to process the traumatic transition from death to life in ways that might have been impossible if consciousness had remained continuous. Throughout the transformation, the dreams and visions that occupied his dormant awareness were fragmented and surreal, combining memories of his previous life with prophetic glimpses of possible futures and symbolic representations of the psychological integration that his resurrection required. The awakening from his coma revealed a consciousness that was recognizably Jason Todd, yet fundamentally altered by his experiences of death and return, creating a personality that retained core characteristics while also displaying new capabilities and limitations that reflected his transformed nature. His intelligence remained intact but was now channeled through thought patterns that incorporated perspectives and insights that had been impossible during his previous existence. While his emotional responses demonstrated both greater intensity and reduced control than had characterized his earlier development, the institutional care facility where he was eventually transferred served as both sanctuary and prison, providing safety and basic needs while also limiting his autonomy and preventing him from acting upon the urges and impulses that his resurrection had created. The staff who monitored his condition were well-intentioned but ultimately inadequate to address the unique challenges of caring for someone whose apparent disabilities masked capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The escape from institutional confinement was accomplished through abilities that his caregivers had not suspected and could not have prepared for, as his enhanced strength and developed stealth skills enabled him to bypass security measures designed for conventional patients rather than resurrected vigilantes. The departure was conducted without violence or malice toward those who had attempted to help him, reflecting retained moral sensibilities despite the confusion and disorientation that characterized his mental state. The return to Gotham's streets initiated a period of instinctive survival that operated independently of conscious memory or rational planning, as his body and mind fell back upon training and experience that had been so thoroughly integrated during his previous life that they functioned automatically despite neurological damage and psychological trauma. His ability to find shelter, acquire food, and avoid detection demonstrated that essential skills had survived his death and resurrection, while also suggesting that his transformation had enhanced rather than diminished his capacity for independent survival. The gradual recovery of memory and identity was neither linear nor complete, occurring in fragments and flashes that slowly coalesced into coherent understanding of who he had been and what had been done to him. The process was painful and disorienting, as each recovered memory brought with it emotional associations and psychological connections that had to be reintegrated into a consciousness that had been fundamentally altered by death and resurrection. Talia al Ghul's intervention in his recovery represented both opportunity and manipulation, as her resources and knowledge provided solutions to his immediate problems, while also serving her own strategic objectives in ways that he was not equipped to recognize or resist in his vulnerable state. Her decision to assist him was motivated by complex factors that included genuine compassion, tactical advantage, and personal interest in someone whose resurrection paralleled her own experiences with death and transformation. The journey to Nanda Parbat and immersion in the Lazarus Pit represented the completion of his resurrection process, addressing the neurological damage and psychological fragmentation that had resulted from his unnatural return to life, while also introducing new complications and capabilities that would define his future development. The mystical energies that completed his healing also altered his fundamental nature in ways that extended beyond mere restoration to encompass enhancement and transformation. The effects of the Lazarus Pit were both beneficial and problematic, restoring his cognitive abilities and emotional stability, while also intensifying his capacity for rage and reducing his natural inhibitions against violence. The psychological changes were subtle but significant, creating a personality that retained Jason Todd's essential characteristics, while also incorporating new aspects that would prove both useful and dangerous in his future activities as the Red Hood. The discovery of everything that had transpired during his absence from the world of the living created a complex mixture of emotions that included relief at Batman's survival, anger at the Joker's continued existence, and devastation at learning that he had been replaced as Robin, without adequate time for mourning or memorial. The knowledge that Bruce had taken another young partner so soon after his death felt like betrayal and abandonment, suggesting that his sacrifice had been quickly forgotten rather than properly honored. The intelligence gathering that revealed the scope of changes in Gotham's criminal landscape and heroic community provided context for his return, while also highlighting the ways that life had continued and evolved during his absence from existence. The new alliances and conflicts that had emerged demonstrated that the world had not stopped to mourn his passing, but had instead adapted and moved forward in ways that made his resurrection both miraculous and irrelevant. The decision to adopt the identity of the Red Hood reflected both psychological necessity and tactical advantage, allowing him to reclaim power over the symbol that represented his destruction, while also providing cover for activities that would have been impossible under his previous identity. The choice of his killer's former persona was neither accidental nor coincidental, but rather deliberate psychological warfare designed to create maximum impact on both enemies and allies who would recognize the significance of the symbol. The months of preparation that preceded his public revelation as the Red Hood involved extensive training, resource acquisition, and strategic planning that drew upon both his previous experience as Robin and new knowledge gained through Talia's instruction and his own investigation of Gotham's current criminal environment. The combination of familiar skills with enhanced abilities created capabilities that exceeded what he had possessed during his previous life, while also incorporating new methods and approaches that reflected his transformed perspective. The criminal operations that he disrupted during his initial activities as the Red Hood were selected not only for their strategic value, but also for their symbolic significance, demonstrating his superior capabilities, while also sending clear messages about his methods and objectives to both the criminal underworld and the heroic community. His willingness to use lethal force against those he deemed deserving of death marked a fundamental departure from Batman's methods, while also representing logical extension of arguments he had made during their philosophical debates. The systematic dismantling of Black Mask's empire was conducted with precision and efficiency that demonstrated both tactical brilliance and intimate knowledge of criminal psychology, as Jason exploited weaknesses and vulnerabilities that his street education and Robin training had taught him to identify and manipulate. The campaign was both personal vendetta and professional demonstration, proving his capabilities while also establishing his credentials as a serious threat to Gotham's established criminal hierarchy. The rules that he established for the criminal organizations that chose to cooperate with rather than oppose him reflected both pragmatic understanding of urban economics and moral boundaries that had survived his death and transformation. His prohibition against selling drugs to children and his requirement that dealers avoid school grounds demonstrated retained compassion for vulnerable populations, while his demand for tribute payments showed understanding of power, dynamics, and resource allocation that could sustain long-term operations. The confrontations with Batman that inevitably resulted from his activities were anticipated and desired, representing opportunities to force acknowledgement of his survival, while also testing the changed dynamics of their relationship. The psychological warfare that characterized these encounters was designed to create maximum emotional impact while also demonstrating his enhanced capabilities and altered perspective on justice and morality. The revelation of his identity to Batman was carefully orchestrated for maximum dramatic effect, combining the shock of resurrection with the horror of transformation in ways that would force Bruce to confront his own failures, while also acknowledging that his former partner had become something unprecedented and potentially uncontrollable. The blood sample that he provided served both practical and symbolic purposes, offering scientific proof of his identity, while also demonstrating his confidence in his own capabilities and his contempt for Batman's skepticism. The capture and torture of the Joker represented the fulfillment of long-deferred justice and the application of proportional punishment to someone whose crimes had exceeded all reasonable boundaries of human tolerance. The use of the same crowbar that had been employed in his own murder was both practical choice and poetic justice, demonstrating that symbols of oppression could be transformed into instruments of liberation when wielded by those who had survived their original purpose. The psychological dimensions of his revenge against the Joker were as carefully planned as the physical aspects, designed to strip away the madman's pretenses and force acknowledgement of the calculated cruelty that lay beneath his facade of insanity. The revelation that the Joker's madness was partially voluntary rather than completely involuntary provided both satisfaction and validation of Jason's long-held belief that some forms of evil could not be excused through claims of mental illness or diminished capacity. The final confrontation in Crime Alley represented the completion of a circle that had begun with Bruce Wayne's transformation into Batman and Jason Todd's recruitment as Robin, bringing together themes of loss, transformation, and the relationship between past and present that had defined all their previous interactions. The location was chosen for its symbolic significance rather than tactical advantage, acknowledging the emotional and psychological importance of the place where both their journeys had begun. The ultimatum that Jason presented to Batman reflected his understanding that their philosophical differences could not be resolved through argument or compromise, but only through decisive action that would demonstrate the superiority of his approach over Bruce's moral constraints. The choice between killing the Joker and killing Jason was designed to force acknowledgement of the practical and emotional costs of Batman's principles, while also providing opportunity for the kind of justice that legal institutions had consistently failed to deliver. The explosion that ended their confrontation without resolving their fundamental disagreements demonstrated that some conflicts could not be concluded through victory or defeat, but only through mutual recognition of irreconcilable differences that made future cooperation impossible, despite shared history and common objectives. The survival of all three participants ensured that their struggles would continue in different forms, while also preserving possibilities for eventual reconciliation or final resolution of their competing visions of justice. The aftermath of the confrontation left Jason's status uncertain and his future unclear, as his survival without decisive victory over either Batman or the Joker created conditions that required new strategies and different approaches to achieving his objectives. The failure to force Batman's conversion to his methods was disappointing, but not unexpected, while his own survival provided opportunities for continued development and eventual resolution of the psychological and moral questions that his resurrection had raised. The transformation from dead Robin to living Red Hood was complete, yet the journey toward understanding his new identity and place in the world had only begun, promising future challenges and opportunities that would test every aspect of his enhanced capabilities, an altered perspective on heroism, justice, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defined existence in Gotham City and beyond. The months that followed Jason Todd's resurrection and violent return to Gotham as the Red Hood were marked not by the satisfaction of completed vengeance, but by the hollow recognition that neither Batman nor the Joker had been fundamentally changed by their confrontation in Crime Alley, that the explosion which ended their three-way standoff had resolved nothing while creating new complications that demanded different strategies and alternative approaches to the pursuit of justice. The survival of all participants in that climactic encounter meant that their philosophical conflicts would continue to evolve rather than conclude. Yet Jason's failure to force Batman's conversion to his methods left him searching for new ways to validate his transformed worldview and demonstrate the superiority of his approach to crime fighting. The decision to target Tim Drake represented both logical strategy and emotional necessity, as the boy who had replaced him as Robin embodied everything that Jason found frustrating about Batman's continued recruitment of children, despite the obvious dangers and his own catastrophic failure to protect his previous partner. The systematic infiltration of Titan's Tower and the careful drugging of its defenders demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded anything Jason had displayed during his previous life, yet the underlying motivation remained deeply personal rather than purely strategic. Tim Drake's youth and obvious competence created complex emotions in Jason that he struggled to process and articulate, as his successor possessed many of the same qualities that had once made him effective as Robin, while also displaying the kind of stable family background and emotional security that Jason had never experienced during his own development. The contrast between their origins and opportunities generated resentment that was both justified and unfair, creating psychological tensions that influenced every aspect of their confrontation. The drugging of the other Titans was accomplished with precision that minimized harm, while ensuring that the encounter between the two Robins would occur without interference from allies who might have altered the tactical dynamics or provided emotional support that could have changed the outcome. Jason's desire for a private confrontation reflected his need for acknowledgement and validation from someone who had inherited his identity, rather than simple desire to inflict harm or demonstrate superiority. The revelation of his Robin costume beneath the Red Hood armor served multiple symbolic purposes, connecting his current identity with his previous role, while also demonstrating that his transformation had not entirely eliminated his attachment to the heroic ideals that had once motivated his partnership with Batman. The visual impact of the costume was carefully calculated to create maximum emotional effect, while also forcing Tim to confront the reality that his predecessor had survived death, but rejected the moral constraints that defined their shared legacy. The physical confrontation that followed demonstrated both Jason's enhanced capabilities and Tim's remarkable resilience under pressure, as the younger boy's tactical training and natural intelligence enabled him to survive an encounter with someone whose strength and experience far exceeded his own. Yet the fight was conducted according to rules that Jason established rather than Tim's preferences, creating conditions that favored the more experienced combatant, while also testing the current Robin's character and determination. Jason's questions about what made Tim special enough to become Robin reflected genuine curiosity, combined with bitter resentment about the apparent ease with which he had been replaced in Batman's affections and operational planning. The interrogation was both personal and professional, seeking to understand whether Tim possessed qualities that justified his selection over other potential candidates, while also exploring whether his own failures had been individual shortcomings rather than systemic problems with Batman's approach to training young partners. The conclusion of their fight demonstrated Jason's retained capacity for mercy and professional respect, as his decision to spare Tim was motivated by recognition of the younger boy's courage and determination, rather than any tactical considerations or emotional manipulation. The acknowledgement that Tim had earned his position through merit, rather than simply availability, provided Jason with information that was both reassuring and disappointing, confirming that Batman's judgment remained sound, while also validating the significance of his own previous contributions. The attack on Dick Grayson represented a different category of confrontation, as Nightwing's status as the original Robin created opportunities for both mentorship and rivalry that were absent from Jason's relationship with his immediate successor. Dick's experience and emotional maturity provided him with advantages that Tim had lacked, yet also created expectations and responsibilities that complicated their interactions in ways that neither participant fully anticipated or prepared for. The impersonation of Nightwing was conducted with the same attention to detail and symbolic significance that had characterized Jason's other activities as the Red Hood, yet the choice to use Dick's identity while committing murders created moral complications that exceeded simple identity theft or tactical deception. The systematic corruption of Nightwing's reputation through association with lethal violence represented an attack on everything that Dick Grayson had built through years of dedicated service and careful relationship building with both criminal and civilian populations. The philosophical dimensions of Jason's conflict with Dick involved questions about the evolution of heroic identity and the relationship between different generations of crime fighters who had inherited the same mentor and training but developed different approaches to applying their shared knowledge. Jason's argument that Dick's methods were inadequately equipped to address contemporary threats was met with counter-arguments about the importance of maintaining moral standards and public trust that could not be preserved through the kind of extreme measures that Jason advocated. The resolution of their confrontation was complicated by external factors that prevented clear victory for either participant, as the intervention of supernatural threats created tactical situations that required cooperation rather than competition between the two former Robins. The temporary alliance that emerged from these circumstances provided opportunities for communication and understanding that might not have been possible under less extreme conditions. Bruce Wayne's return from his apparent death created new possibilities for reconciliation and renewed conflict, as his survival eliminated one of the primary sources of Jason's anger, while also raising questions about whether their philosophical differences could be resolved through direct engagement rather than violent confrontation. The revelation that Batman had not actually been killed by Darkseid, but had instead been displaced through time, provided context for many of the decisions and actions that had occurred during his absence from Gotham. The Batman Incorporated initiative represented Bruce's attempt to address global crime through expanded operations and increased coordination with international partners. Yet the inclusion of Jason in these plans created complications that reflected both his unique capabilities and his problematic methods. The conditional nature of his acceptance into the program demonstrated that Bruce remained committed to his moral principles, while also acknowledging that Jason's skills and perspective might be valuable if properly directed and constrained. The single rule that governed Jason's participation in Batman Incorporated was elegantly simple yet practically complex, as the prohibition against killing while operating in Gotham created clear boundaries, while also raising questions about jurisdiction and the relationship between local and international operations. Jason's acceptance of these constraints represented significant compromise on his part, while also providing Bruce with evidence that reconciliation might be possible despite their previous conflicts. The reaction of other Bat family members to Jason's conditional rehabilitation ranged from cautious optimism to outright skepticism, reflecting their individual relationships with him and their assessment of his capacity for genuine change, rather than tactical cooperation. Tim Drake's concerns were particularly significant given their previous confrontation and his direct experience of Jason's enhanced capabilities and altered psychological state. Dick Grayson's response to Jason's inclusion in the family operations was complicated by their recent conflicts and his understanding of the challenges involved in managing someone whose methods and motivations remained fundamentally different from those of other team members. His willingness to support Bruce's decision while maintaining appropriate caution demonstrated both loyalty to their mentor and realistic assessment of the risks involved in trusting someone whose transformation remained incomplete. Alfred's perspective on Jason's return to the family reflected both his natural compassion for someone he had helped raise and his practical concerns about the psychological dynamics that such inclusion might create within the established team structure. His quiet support for Jason's rehabilitation was balanced by careful monitoring of the emotional and operational consequences that resulted from his renewed presence in their operations. The training and orientation that preceded Jason's active participation in Batman Incorporated involved both refresher courses in techniques and procedures that had evolved during his absence and intensive evaluation of his current capabilities and limitations. The assessment process revealed that his death and resurrection had enhanced certain aspects of his performance while creating new challenges that required accommodation and adaptation. The missions assigned to Jason during his probationary period were carefully selected to provide meaningful contribution opportunities, while minimizing risks to both innocent civilians and team cohesion that might have resulted from placing him in situations that exceeded his current emotional and psychological capacity for restraint. The gradual increase in responsibility and autonomy that followed successful completion of these assignments reflected growing confidence in his reliability and judgment. The psychological counseling that accompanied Jason's rehabilitation was conducted by specialists who understood both trauma recovery and the unique challenges faced by individuals whose experiences included death and resurrection. The therapy sessions provided opportunities for processing grief, anger, and identity confusion that had resulted from his transformation, while also developing coping strategies for managing the enhanced emotions and altered perspectives that characterized his current mental state. The relationship dynamics within the expanded Bat family required constant attention and adjustment, as Jason's presence created new tensions while also resolving some long-standing issues related to guilt and loss that had affected other members since his death. The process of integration was neither smooth nor automatic, requiring patience and understanding from all participants as they navigated the complexities of incorporating someone whose experiences had been so fundamentally different from their own. The external threats that tested the reformed family structure provided opportunities for Jason to demonstrate his commitment to their shared values, while also revealing areas where his methods and philosophy continued to diverge from those of his colleagues. His performance during crisis situations showed that cooperation was possible despite philosophical differences, yet also highlighted the ongoing need for clear communication and mutual respect. The public response to rumors about Jason's survival and involvement with Batman's operations was complicated by the official story of his death and the symbolic significance that his memory had acquired within Gotham's cultural narrative about heroism and sacrifice. The careful management of information about his return required sophisticated media coordination and strategic communication that protected both operational security and his personal privacy. The criminal underworld's reaction to evidence of Jason's continued existence created ripple effects throughout Gotham's illegal enterprises, as individuals who had assumed his death was permanent were forced to reassess their assumptions about Batman's methods and the consequences of opposing his operations. The fear and uncertainty that resulted from these revelations served tactical purposes, while also demonstrating the psychological impact that his previous activities as the Red Hood had created. The legal implications of Jason's official death and unofficial return created complex administrative challenges that required careful coordination between various governmental agencies and law enforcement organizations. The bureaucratic complications involved in managing someone who was legally deceased while operationally active demanded creative solutions that protected both his identity and the integrity of official records. The financial arrangements necessary to support Jason's activities while maintaining his official non-existence required sophisticated planning and resource allocation that drew upon both Wayne family wealth and Batman Incorporated's international funding sources. The practical challenges of providing equipment, transportation, and logistical support to someone who could not legally exist created operational complications that required constant attention and innovative solutions. The gradual expansion of Jason's role within the organization reflected both his demonstrated reliability and the growing recognition that his unique perspective and capabilities provided valuable assets for addressing certain types of threats and challenges. His evolution from probationary member to trusted partner represented significant progress in both his personal development and his relationship with the family that had never stopped caring about him despite their disappointment and anger at his choices. The periodic setbacks and conflicts that occurred during this process were neither unexpected nor necessarily problematic, as they provided opportunities for communication and problem-solving that strengthened relationships, while also establishing clearer boundaries and expectations for future cooperation. The ability to work through disagreements without resorting to violence or permanent estrangement demonstrated growth and maturity in all participants. The Flash's alteration of the timeline through his misguided attempt to prevent his mother's death created cosmic disruptions that affected every aspect of reality. Yet the changes that resulted from Flashpoint were neither uniform nor predictable in their impact on individual lives and relationships. The New 52 continuity that emerged from these temporal manipulations preserved some elements of previous history, while altering or eliminating others in ways that created both opportunities and challenges for everyone involved. Jason's survival of the timeline alteration with most of his memories and relationships intact provided stability during a period of widespread confusion and adjustment, yet the changes in other people's histories and the elimination of certain shared experiences created new forms of isolation and disconnection that required different coping strategies and support systems. The preservation of his core identity, while losing some of the context that had shaped his development, created psychological challenges that were both familiar and unprecedented. The formation of the Red Hood and the Outlaws represented Jason's response to the changing circumstances and his desire to maintain meaningful connections with others who had been similarly affected by the timeline alterations. The team structure provided him with opportunities for leadership and partnership that were different from his previous experiences as Robin, while also allowing him to develop new aspects of his identity and capabilities. The selection of Arsenal and Starfire as his partners reflected both practical considerations about complementary skills and emotional needs for connection with individuals who understood the challenges of operating outside traditional, heroic structures while maintaining commitment to protecting innocent life. Their shared experiences of loss, transformation, and complicated relationships with mainstream hero communities created bonds that transcended simple, tactical cooperation. The missions undertaken by the Outlaws provided Jason with opportunities to apply his enhanced capabilities and evolved philosophy in service of causes that were both meaningful and personally satisfying. Yet the team's independence from Batman's direct oversight also created risks and responsibilities that tested his leadership skills and moral judgment in ways that his previous roles had not required. The success of these operations demonstrated that Jason's transformation had created genuine capabilities rather than simply altered his approach to existing skills. Yet the ongoing evolution of his character and methods showed that his development was far from complete and that future growth remained both possible and necessary. The journey toward understanding his place in the world continued, promising further challenges and opportunities for discovering the full potential of his resurrected existence. The formation of the Red Hood and the Outlaws emerged not from careful strategic planning or institutional directive, but from the organic convergence of three damaged souls whose individual journeys through trauma, loss, and transformation had left them uniquely suited for partnership, despite their disparate origins and conflicting approaches to heroism. The timeline alterations that had reshaped reality's fundamental structure created opportunities for connections that might never have formed under previous circumstances, bringing together individuals whose shared experiences of abandonment and betrayal transcended the cultural and philosophical differences that separated their backgrounds and methodologies. Roy Harper's descent from respected hero to broken addict represented one of the most tragic consequences of the superhero community's failure to provide adequate support for individuals whose dedication to protecting others came at enormous personal cost. His transformation from Arsenal into a hollow shell consumed by pharmaceutical escape reflected systemic problems within heroic culture that prioritized operational effectiveness over psychological welfare, creating conditions where even the most capable individuals could be destroyed by accumulated trauma and unprocessed grief that exceeded their capacity for independent recovery. The addiction that consumed Roy's existence was neither moral failing nor character weakness, but rather the inevitable result of pain management strategies that had evolved from legitimate medical necessity into self-destructive patterns that provided temporary relief while creating deeper problems that required increasingly extreme measures to address. His dependence upon chemical solutions to emotional suffering demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional support systems within the superhero community, where admission of psychological vulnerability was often interpreted as operational liability rather than human need, requiring compassionate intervention. Starfire's exile from Tamaran and subsequent struggle to find belonging within Earth's heroic community reflected different but equally profound forms of displacement and cultural alienation that created psychological wounds, requiring specialized healing approaches unavailable through conventional therapeutic methods. Her warrior culture's emphasis on direct action and emotional expression often conflicted with human social expectations that prioritized restraint and diplomatic solutions, creating constant tension between authentic self-expression and social integration that left her feeling perpetually isolated despite her obvious capabilities and genuine desire to help others. The sexual liberation that characterized Tamaranian culture was frequently misunderstood and misrepresented by human observers, who lacked the cultural context necessary to appreciate the philosophical foundations that informed her approach to relationships and intimacy. Her openness about physical desires and emotional needs was interpreted through human moral frameworks that emphasized restriction and judgment rather than acceptance and understanding, creating barriers to genuine connection that reinforced her sense of alienation despite her efforts to adapt to local customs and expectations. The convergence of these three individuals in the aftermath of the timeline alterations was facilitated by their shared recognition that traditional heroic institutions had failed to provide the support and understanding they required for effective psychological healing and meaningful contribution to the ongoing struggle against forces that threatened innocent life. Their decision to form an independent team reflected both practical necessity and emotional need for connection with others who understood the complexities of operating outside mainstream heroic culture while maintaining commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. Jason's role as team leader represented significant evolution from his previous existence as junior partner and occasional antagonist, requiring him to develop new skills in diplomacy, strategy, and emotional support that his training as Robin had not emphasized or prepared him to exercise effectively. The responsibility for coordinating operations while also managing the interpersonal dynamics created by three strong personalities with different approaches to conflict resolution tested his maturity and judgment in ways that forced continued growth and self-examination. The dynamic that emerged between Arsenal and Red Hood was characterized by mutual understanding, born from shared experiences of loss and betrayal. Yet their different responses to trauma created both opportunities for support and sources of conflict that required constant navigation and negotiation. Roy's addiction represented a path that Jason might have taken under different circumstances, while Jason's embrace of lethal force demonstrated choices that Roy had considered but ultimately rejected in favor of chemical escape and emotional numbing. The relationship between Jason and Starfire developed along lines that neither participant had anticipated or initially welcomed, as their cultural differences and contrasting approaches to emotional processing created barriers that required patience and understanding to overcome. Her warrior directness challenged his tendency toward emotional withdrawal and strategic manipulation, while his human complexity provided her with insights into psychological subtleties that Tamaranian culture had not prepared her to navigate effectively. The missions undertaken by the Outlaws were selected not only for their strategic importance, but also for their therapeutic value in providing team members with opportunities to apply their skills in service of causes that validated their worth, while also addressing the psychological needs that traditional heroic structures had failed to recognize or accommodate. The international scope of their operations reflected both practical considerations about avoiding interference from established authorities and emotional requirements for independence that enabled authentic self-expression without external judgment or constraint. The All-Cast represented Jason's first encounter with mystical traditions that offered alternative frameworks for understanding heroism and justice that transcended the conventional moral categories that had defined his previous training and development. The monastery's emphasis on balance between opposing forces provided philosophical context for his struggles with lethal methods, while also validating his instincts about the inadequacy of purely reactive approaches to persistent threats that conventional law enforcement could not address effectively. The training he received from the All-Cased integrated physical techniques with spiritual disciplines that addressed the psychological damage created by his death and resurrection, while also enhancing his natural capabilities in ways that enabled more effective application of his skills in service of justice and protection. The mystical elements of his education provided access to powers and insights that complemented his technological resources and tactical knowledge, creating a more comprehensive foundation for his activities as team leader and independent hero. The destruction of the All-Caste by the Untitled represented both personal loss and philosophical challenge, as the systematic elimination of his mentors and spiritual guides forced him to integrate their teachings independently, while also seeking vengeance against enemies who threatened the mystical balance that protected reality from supernatural threats that transcended normal categories of criminal activity. The responsibility for preserving and continuing the All-Caste's mission added new dimensions to his identity that extended beyond personal healing toward cosmic obligations that required different approaches to heroism and justice. The sacrifice of his fondest memory in service of accessing the power necessary to defeat the Untitled demonstrated Jason's continued capacity for heroic choice-making, despite his struggles with moral ambiguity and tactical disagreements with mainstream heroic communities. The willingness to surrender cherished experiences of love and acceptance in order to protect others validated his transformation from selfish criminal to genuine hero, while also illustrating the costs that such development required from those who chose to serve causes greater than personal satisfaction. Bizarro's introduction to the team represented both challenge and opportunity, as his reverse psychology and unpredictable capabilities required new approaches to communication and coordination, while also providing insights into the nature of heroism and the importance of acceptance regardless of apparent limitations or unconventional methods. His genuine desire to help combined with his inability to understand conventional logic created scenarios that tested the team's patience and adaptability, while also demonstrating the value of compassion and understanding in dealing with individuals whose differences might otherwise create barriers to cooperation. The relationship that developed between Jason and Bizarro reflected Jason's own experiences of feeling misunderstood and rejected by those who should have provided support and acceptance, creating empathy that enabled him to see beyond surface appearances toward the essential goodness that motivated Bizarro's actions, despite their often counterproductive results. The patience and kindness that Jason displayed in dealing with Bizarro's limitations demonstrated significant personal growth, while also providing the imperfect Superman with the validation and guidance he needed for his own development. The base of operations that Bizarro created for the team represented both practical advantage and symbolic validation, as his construction of facilities that could transport them anywhere in the universe provided tactical capabilities that exceeded those available to most heroic organizations, while also demonstrating his commitment to their shared mission, despite his cognitive limitations. The doorway technology that enabled instantaneous travel to any location created opportunities for rapid response to global threats, while also eliminating logistical constraints that might otherwise have limited their effectiveness. The gradual deterioration of Bizarro's enhanced intelligence as a result of his continued exposure to kryptonite created both tactical challenges and emotional difficulties for team members who had grown attached to him during his period of improved cognitive functioning. The knowledge that his increased capabilities were temporary and that his continued use of the substance that provided them was also destroying his mental faculties created moral dilemmas about intervention versus respect for personal autonomy that tested the team's unity and commitment to individual freedom. Artemis's replacement of Starfire as the team's female member reflected both operational necessities created by the changing circumstances and emotional evolution within the group dynamic that required different approaches to interpersonal relationships and tactical coordination. Her Amazon warrior background provided combat capabilities and strategic perspectives that complemented Jason's leadership, while also creating new sources of conflict and cooperation that influenced the team's effectiveness and internal cohesion. The relationship between Jason and Artemis developed along different lines than his previous partnership with Starfire, characterized by mutual respect for combat abilities and tactical judgment rather than romantic attraction or cultural curiosity. Their shared experiences as warriors, who had been displaced from their original communities, created understanding that enabled effective cooperation, while also maintaining appropriate professional boundaries that preserved team unity and operational effectiveness. The major threats that the Outlaws confronted during their various missions tested not only their individual capabilities, but also their capacity for cooperation and mutual support under extreme pressure that revealed both strengths, weaknesses in their team dynamic. The cosmic-level enemies and supernatural dangers that they encountered required coordination and sacrifice that demonstrated their evolution from individual heroes seeking personal validation toward genuine partners committed to protecting innocent life regardless of personal cost. The adventures that took them across the globe and beyond provided opportunities for each team member to contribute unique skills and perspectives, while also learning from their partners' different approaches to problem solving and conflict resolution. The international scope of their operations demonstrated their effectiveness as independent heroes, while also validating their choice to operate outside traditional institutional structures that might have constrained their methods or limited their ability to address threats that exceeded conventional categories. The personal growth that each team member experienced through their partnership reflected both the therapeutic value of meaningful relationships and the importance of shared purpose in providing context for individual development and psychological healing. Jason's evolution from angry vigilante, seeking vengeance toward mature leader, accepting responsibility for others, demonstrated that his resurrection had created opportunities for positive change rather than simply enabling continued destructive behavior. Roy's gradual recovery from addiction through the support and understanding provided by his teammates illustrated the importance of community and acceptance in addressing psychological wounds that individual effort alone could not heal effectively. His return to operational effectiveness and emotional stability validated the team's approach to mutual support, while also demonstrating that redemption was possible for those willing to accept help and work toward positive change. Starfire's journey toward greater understanding of human culture and emotional complexity was facilitated by her teammates' patience and willingness to explain social nuances that her warrior background had not prepared her to recognize or navigate successfully. Her integration of human emotional restraint with Tamaranian directness created new approaches to interpersonal relationships that honored both her cultural heritage and her adopted home's social expectations. The temporary separations that occurred within the team structure reflected both operational necessities and personal growth requirements that sometimes demanded independent action and individual development rather than constant group cooperation. These periods apart provided opportunities for team members to apply lessons learned through partnership, while also maintaining their individual identities and personal relationships outside the team structure. The reunions that followed these separations demonstrated the strength of the bonds that had been forged through shared struggle and mutual support. As team members consistently chose to return to partnership despite opportunities for independent operation or integration with other heroic organizations. The voluntary nature of their continued association validated the therapeutic and operational value of their relationships, while also illustrating their commitment to shared ideals and mutual protection. The evolution of Jason's role within the team, from leader seeking validation toward mentor providing guidance, reflected his continued psychological development and growing understanding of his own capabilities and limitations. His willingness to place team welfare above personal satisfaction demonstrated maturity that had been absent from his earlier activities as Robin and Red Hood, while also validating his transformation from victim seeking revenge toward hero, accepting responsibility for others' welfare. The impact of their adventures on each team member's individual character development was both positive and challenging, as exposure to different perspectives and approaches required constant adaptation and growth that sometimes created internal conflicts between old patterns and new possibilities. The ongoing process of change and development that characterized their partnership demonstrated that heroism was not a fixed state, but rather a continuous journey toward better understanding of oneself and one's obligations to others. The legacy of their partnership extended beyond their specific accomplishments toward broader influence on heroic culture and the recognition that alternative approaches to team structure and operational methodology could be as effective as traditional institutional models, while also providing therapeutic benefits that conventional organizations often failed to address. Their success as independent heroes validated the importance of individual choice and personal autonomy in determining how one's capabilities could best serve causes greater than personal satisfaction. The family dynamic that emerged within the team structure provided each member with experiences of acceptance and support that had been absent from their previous relationships, creating emotional healing that enabled more effective application of their individual skills, while also demonstrating the importance of genuine connection in maintaining psychological wellness and operational effectiveness. The love and loyalty that bound them together transcended simple, tactical cooperation toward authentic family bonds that provided meaning and context for their individual sacrifices and shared struggles. The knowledge and skills that each team member gained through their partnership prepared them for future challenges and opportunities that would require independent operation while maintaining the emotional connections and shared values that had been developed through their time together. The foundation that had been established through mutual support and understanding would continue to influence their individual development long after their formal partnership had ended, demonstrating the lasting value of genuine relationships formed through shared struggle and mutual acceptance. The conclusion of their formal partnership represented not failure or abandonment, but rather natural evolution toward new challenges and opportunities that required different approaches and different partnerships while maintaining the essential lessons and emotional connections that had been forged through their shared experiences. The gratitude and affection that characterized their farewells validated the therapeutic and operational success of their association, while also acknowledging that growth sometimes required separation and independent development rather than continued dependence on familiar structures and relationships. The return to Gotham City as the Red Hood marked not the culmination of Jason Todd's journey toward redemption, but rather the beginning of its most complex and morally ambiguous chapter, as he chose to establish himself within the very criminal underworld he had once fought against, while maintaining the paradoxical objective of protecting innocent life through methods that conventional heroes found unacceptable and law enforcement agencies could neither sanction nor effectively oppose. The decision to claim ownership of the Iceberg Lounge following the Penguin's demise represented both strategic positioning within Gotham's criminal hierarchy and philosophical statement about the possibility of reforming corrupt systems from within, rather than attempting to destroy them through external pressure alone. The transformation of Oswald Cobblepot's former establishment into a base of operations for Jason's unique approach to crime control required extensive modifications that reflected both practical security considerations and symbolic representations of his evolved understanding of justice and power. The venue's existing infrastructure provided advantages that conventional heroic headquarters could not offer, including established connections to information networks and supply chains that enabled more effective intelligence gathering and resource acquisition than would have been possible through legitimate channels alone. The criminal empire that Jason inherited through his elimination of the Penguin was neither dismantled nor expanded, but rather restructured according to principles that reflected his complex moral framework and practical understanding of urban economics. His approach to managing illegal enterprises emphasized harm reduction rather than elimination, recognizing that complete eradication of criminal activity was impossible, while meaningful reduction in violence and exploitation remained achievable through proper oversight and strategic intervention. The rules that governed operations under his authority were designed to minimize damage to vulnerable populations while maintaining sufficient profitability to ensure stability and cooperation from subordinates who might otherwise have sought more permissive leadership. His prohibition against drug sales to minors and his requirement for violence to be employed only as last resort created operational constraints that many criminal organizations would have found unacceptable. Yet his reputation for lethal enforcement ensured compliance, despite the apparent limitations on traditional criminal methodologies. Batman's discovery of Jason's new role created immediate complications that tested both their capacity for cooperation and their ability to maintain operational effectiveness while navigating complex legal and moral territories that neither had previously explored in depth. Bruce's inability to arrest Jason without exposing his own identity created tactical advantages that the Red Hood exploited, while also demonstrating the practical limitations that constrained traditional approaches to law enforcement. In situations involving individuals with intimate knowledge of heroic operations and methods, the uncomfortable truce that emerged from their mutual recognition of these constraints was characterized by careful avoidance of direct confrontation, combined with ongoing surveillance and interference that reflected both Bruce's continued concern for Jason's moral development and his practical acknowledgement that complete prevention of the Red Hood's activities was neither possible nor necessarily desirable, given their demonstrated effectiveness in reducing certain categories of violent crime. The psychological dynamics that defined their renewed relationship were complicated by unresolved grief and guilt that neither participant had adequately processed or discussed openly, creating undercurrents of tension that influenced every interaction, while also generating opportunities for communication and understanding that might eventually lead toward genuine reconciliation. Jason's deliberate provocations were designed to force acknowledgement of his survival and capabilities, while also testing Bruce's commitment to principles that had previously prevented him from accepting more pragmatic approaches to persistent criminal threats. The drug epidemic that swept through Gotham in the form of the designer substance known as cheer represented exactly the kind of complex threat that Jason's methods were particularly suited to address. As its distribution networks operated outside traditional law enforcement jurisdiction, while its effects created victims who required both immediate medical intervention and long-term social support that conventional systems were inadequately equipped to provide effectively. The investigation into cheer's origins and distribution methods required cooperation between Jason's criminal contacts and Batman's technological resources, creating opportunities for tactical collaboration that demonstrated the potential benefits of combining their different approaches and information sources. The complexity of the case demanded both street-level intelligence and sophisticated analysis capabilities that neither individual could have provided independently, yet their joint efforts proved remarkably effective at identifying key players and disrupting supply chains. Tyler's story served as both catalyst for Jason's continued evolution and validation of his capacity for genuine heroism despite his employment of methods that mainstream heroes found morally objectionable. The boy's innocent trust and obvious need for protection awakened protective instincts that had been dormant since Jason's resurrection. Yet, his tragic family circumstances also provided stark evidence of the systemic failures that created conditions requiring extreme interventions that legal institutions could not address effectively. The murder of Tyler's father represented a critical moment in Jason's moral development, as his decision to kill someone who posed ongoing threats to a vulnerable child demonstrated both the strength of his protective instincts and the limitations of his emotional control when confronted with evidence of systematic abuse and exploitation. The act was neither premeditated nor strategic, but rather instinctive response to immediate threat, yet its consequences would influence his subsequent choices and his understanding of his own capacity for both heroism and violence. The realization that his actions had deprived Tyler of his only remaining parent, regardless of that parent's obvious inadequacy and criminal behavior, created psychological trauma that forced Jason to confront the unintended consequences of his methods, while also acknowledging the complexity of situations where no available choices could produce entirely positive outcomes. The knowledge that he had acted to protect an innocent child could not entirely mitigate his recognition that his intervention had also created new forms of harm and loss. The decision to abandon firearms represented perhaps the most significant evolution in Jason's approach to crime fighting since his resurrection, reflecting both practical understanding of the ripple effects that lethal force created and emotional recognition that his capacity for violence required more careful regulation than he had previously been willing to acknowledge or accept. The symbolic importance of this choice extended beyond tactical considerations toward fundamental questions about identity and the relationship between methods and objectives that had defined his entire post-resurrection existence. The partnership with Tyler that emerged from their shared trauma provided Jason with opportunities to experience the kind of mentorship relationship that had been absent from his own development. Yet it also created new responsibilities and emotional vulnerabilities that tested his capacity for selflessness and genuine care for another person's welfare. The boy's obvious admiration and trust forced Jason to consider the example he was setting, while also providing him with motivation for continued growth and positive change. The confrontation with the Cheer drug network revealed both Jason's enhanced investigative capabilities and his growing capacity for strategic thinking that incorporated long-term consequences rather than focusing solely on immediate tactical advantages. His approach to dismantling the distribution system emphasized prevention of future operations rather than simple punishment of current participants, demonstrating evolution toward more sophisticated understanding of crime prevention and community protection. Batman's dependency on the Cheer drug during his investigation created role reversal that forced Jason to assume responsibility for his mentor's welfare, while also providing him with insights into Bruce's psychological vulnerabilities and the personal costs that his mission imposed upon his mental and emotional stability. The experience of saving Batman rather than being saved by him represented significant symbolic milestone in their relationship, while also validating Jason's development as an independent hero capable of providing support rather than merely receiving it. The perfect dream that the cheer drug induced in Batman revealed depths of regret and longing that Bruce had never expressed openly. Yet Jason's ability to penetrate that fantasy and guide his mentor back toward reality demonstrated both tactical competence and emotional maturity that exceeded anything he had displayed during his previous life as Robin. The rescue required not physical strength but psychological understanding and emotional courage that validated his transformation from angry victim toward genuine hero. The family dinner invitation that concluded their collaboration represented acknowledgement of Jason's place within the extended network of individuals who shared commitment to protecting Gotham while also maintaining their individual approaches and operational independence. Bruce's willingness to extend such recognition reflected both appreciation for Jason's contributions and acceptance of his evolved methods, though the invitation also carried implications of continued expectation for growth and positive development. The red uniform that accompanied Bruce's invitation served as both practical equipment and symbolic recognition of Jason's unique role within the heroic community, acknowledging his differences while also affirming his membership in the extended family of protectors who served Gotham's interests through diverse means and approaches. The costume represented neither complete acceptance of his methods nor rejection of his contributions, but rather recognition that heroism could take many forms while maintaining essential commitments to justice and protection of innocent life. The challenges that followed Jason's apparent integration into the Bat family structure demonstrated that reconciliation was an ongoing process rather than achieved state, requiring constant navigation of competing priorities and occasional conflicts that tested everyone's commitment to cooperation and mutual support. The setbacks and disagreements that occurred were neither unexpected nor necessarily problematic, providing opportunities for communication and problem-solving that strengthened relationships while establishing clearer boundaries and expectations. The brain damage that Jason suffered during the Gotham War event represented both tactical defeat and philosophical challenge, as his temporary incapacitation forced recognition that even enhanced individuals remained vulnerable to sophisticated attacks that exploited specific weaknesses or limitations. The medical intervention required to address his injuries created periods of dependency that contrasted sharply with his usual self-reliance, while also providing opportunities for other family members to demonstrate their care and commitment to his welfare. The manipulation by the Joker that transformed Jason temporarily into a more villainous version of himself served as a reminder that his psychological stability remained vulnerable to external influences that could exploit unresolved trauma and unprocessed anger. Despite years of apparent progress and development, the reversion to more destructive patterns illustrated that healing was neither complete nor permanent, but rather required ongoing vigilance and support from others who understood the challenges involved. The recovery from these setbacks demonstrated both Jason's resilience and the strength of the relationships he had built with others who were committed to his continued growth and positive development. The willingness of family members to provide support during his most vulnerable moments validated the bonds that had been forged through shared struggle, while also illustrating the practical benefits of maintaining connections with others who shared similar values and objectives. The ongoing evolution of Jason's character and methods reflected both internal growth and external influences that continued to shape his understanding of heroism and his place within the larger community of individuals committed to protecting innocent life. His development was neither linear nor predictable, but rather characterized by advances and retreats that reflected the complex nature of psychological change and moral development in someone whose experiences had been so fundamentally different from conventional patterns. The recognition that Jason's journey toward redemption and integration remained incomplete did not diminish the significance of his achievements or the value of his contributions to the ongoing struggle against forces that threatened Gotham's welfare. His unique perspective and capabilities provided resources that complemented, rather than duplicated, those available through other heroes, creating tactical advantages that enhanced overall effectiveness, while also validating alternative approaches to common challenges. The relationships that Jason maintained with other members of the heroic community were characterized by mutual respect and careful cooperation rather than easy friendship or automatic trust, reflecting realistic assessment of compatibility and shared objectives rather than sentimental attachment to family connections that might not translate into operational effectiveness. His position within the group was earned through demonstrated competence and reliability rather than assumed through historical associations or emotional appeals. The future challenges that awaited Jason were both personal and professional, requiring continued development of his capabilities, while also maintaining the emotional connections and moral foundations that prevented his enhanced abilities from becoming destructive rather than protective. His ongoing journey toward understanding his place in the world promised continued growth and evolution that would test every aspect of his character, while also providing opportunities for positive contribution to causes greater than individual satisfaction. The legacy that Jason Todd was building through his post-resurrection activities extended beyond his personal redemption toward broader influence on heroic culture and the recognition that transformation and growth remained possible, even for individuals whose experiences had been marked by profound trauma and moral failure. His example demonstrated that death need not be the end of one's story, that mistakes could be overcome through dedicated effort, and that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when supported by genuine commitment to serving others rather than pursuing personal validation. The wisdom that Jason had gained through his unique experiences of death, resurrection, and moral struggle provided him with perspectives and insights that were unavailable to those who had followed more conventional paths toward heroism. Yet his knowledge was neither superior to nor incompatible with approaches developed by others who had found different ways of serving similar objectives. His contributions to the heroic community were valuable precisely because they were different, offering alternatives and innovations that enhanced overall effectiveness while maintaining essential commitments to justice and protection of innocent life. The acceptance that Jason had finally achieved within the extended family of Gotham's protectors represented neither complete approval of his methods nor abandonment of hope for continued growth, but rather recognition that heroism could take many forms while maintaining core principles about the value of life and the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. His place within the community was secure, not because his development was complete, but because his commitment was genuine and his contributions were meaningful, regardless of the unconventional nature of his approaches and the continuing evolution of his methods and philosophy. And so concludes our journey through the shadows and light that have shaped Jason Peter Todd, the Red Hood, whose story serves as testament to the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest corners of human experience. From the streets of Crime Alley to the halls of Wayne Manor, from the depths of death to the heights of heroic purpose, his tale reminds us that identity is not determined by our origins or our failures, but by the choices we make each day. to rise above our pain and serve something greater than ourselves. In Jason's struggle between vengeance and justice, between isolation and family, between death and rebirth, we find reflected the eternal human journey toward understanding, forgiveness, and belonging. Rest now, dreamer of second chances, knowing that even the most broken among us can find their way back to the light, and that redemption is always possible for those willing to fight for it. May your sleep be as peaceful as Gotham, when all its protectors stand united in purpose and love.